Chapter 1. The Curse-Breaker's Instinct. Bill Weasley could have been back in Egypt by now, standing hip-deep in sand, while ancient curses whispered threats from tomb walls that hadn't seen sunlight in 3,000 years. It would have been gloriously, recklessly dangerous. But the memory of Fleur's silver hair catching torchlight during the third task pulled him back to the present, to Mrs. Figg's overgrown garden on Privet Drive, where the most exotic danger was stepping on her cat. He settled against the garden wall, checking his pocket watch in the dying July light. 23 minutes past 7. His first solo surveillance shift for the Order, watching over the boy who lived, while said boy remained blissfully unaware that half the wizarding world was taking turns crouched in suburban hedgerows. The transition from tomb raider to desk clerk hadn't been as straightforward as Dumbledore had suggested. Bill's hands, still scarred from Egyptian sand and cursed artifacts, felt clumsy around quills and ledgers. His body missed the weight of his curse-breaking kit, the familiar press of detection amulets against his chest. Even now, old habit made him reach for instruments that weren't there. But some instincts, thankfully, didn't require tools. Bill's training kicked in the moment he focused on number 4 Privet Drive. Something was wrong with the magical signature of the house. Not wrong, exactly. Layered. Complex in a way that made his curse-breaker's eye narrow with professional suspicion. Blood wards, certainly. He could feel Lily Potter's sacrifice humming in the foundation stones, protective magic so pure it made his teeth ache. Dumbledore's work, anchored by Petunia Dursley's grudging acceptance of her nephew. Textbook sacrificial magic, beautiful in its simplicity. But there was something else. Bill closed his eyes and extended his magical senses, a technique learned in the deepest chambers of pyramid tombs, where visual cues meant nothing, and only magical resonance could guide you safely past ancient traps. The blood ward pulsed with steady, maternal warmth. Beneath it, though, threaded through it like a parasite vine. His eyes snapped open. There was a second ward structure, not beneath the blood protection, but braided into it, so carefully integrated that most wizards would never notice the distinction. Bill only caught it because 15 years of curse-breaking had taught him to detect magical forgery, to spot where ancient protective spells had been tampered with by tomb robbers or ambitious archaeologists. Someone had modified Dumbledore's ward. Bill pulled his backup detection kit from his robes, not the full arsenal he'd carried in Egypt, but the basics every curse-breaker kept within reach, a silver compass that pointed toward magical disturbances rather than magnetic north, a small crystal that changed color in the presence of different magical signatures, a piece of parchment charmed to map energy flows. The compass spun wildly, then locked onto the house with such force that Bill nearly dropped it. The crystal shifted through the spectrum, warm gold for the blood protection, then a sickly yellow-green that made Bill's stomach clench with recognition. Draining magic. Energy siphoning, the kind of curse that slowly, invisibly, leached power from its target until they withered away to nothing. Bill's hands shook as he unrolled the parchment. Magical energy flows appeared as silver threads across its surface, mapping the ward structure in precise detail. The blood protection showed as a strong, steady pulse centered on the house. But the secondary magic, the draining ward, showed a different pattern entirely. It wasn't just siphoning energy. It was feeding somewhere else. The silver thread of stolen magic stretched away from Privet Drive, beyond the range of his detection parchment, toward some distant destination that was consuming Harry Potter's power like a slow, invisible poison. Bill stared at the parchment, his curse-breaker's mind racing through possibilities. Tomb magic, certainly. Ancient draining curses were common enough in Egyptian burial chambers, designed to steal the life force of grave robbers. But this wasn't some ancient trap triggered by accident. This was deliberate, precise, modern, and it had been active for years. The implications hit him like a curse blast to the chest. Harry Potter, the boy who had survived Voldemort, who carried the hopes of the entire wizarding world, was being slowly, systematically drained of his magical strength. Had been drained, perhaps, since the day he arrived at Privet Drive as a baby. Bill's professional training warred with his family loyalty. The Weasleys had welcomed Harry like another son. Ron spoke of him with fierce protectiveness. Mrs. Weasley fretted over him like he was her own blood. The idea that someone had been hurting Harry for 15 years, right under everyone's nose. The crystal in his hand flared bright yellow-green, responding to his surge of anger. Bill forced himself to breathe, to think like a curse-breaker instead of a protective big brother. First rule of curse-breaking: document everything before you disturb anything. Second rule: never assume you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. Bill carefully rolled up the detection parchment and tucked it inside his robes, then settled back against the garden wall to think. Mrs. Fig's cats wound around his ankles, sensing his tension but offering silent, furry comfort. Someone had done this to Harry. Someone with the skill to modify Dumbledore's ward work without detection. Someone with access to the boy during his most vulnerable years. Someone who could benefit from slowly stealing a wizard's magical development over more than a decade. The sick feeling in Bill's stomach deepened as he realized how few people fit that description. But speculation was dangerous territory. He needed more information before he started making accusations that could tear the Order apart. What he needed was a closer look at that secondary ward, a better understanding of where the stolen energy was flowing. What he needed was to return to Privet Drive with his full curse-breaking arsenal and map every thread of magic surrounding the house. Because if his suspicions were correct, if someone had turned Harry Potter into an unwitting magical battery for 15 years, then the boy who had already sacrificed so much was about to learn that his childhood had been stolen in ways far worse than even he imagined. Bill checked his watch again. 3 hours until his shift ended, and Tonks arrived to relieve him. 3 hours to watch number 4, Privet Drive, and wrestle with the knowledge that something monstrous was happening right behind those cheerfully ordinary suburban walls. 3 hours to decide what he was going to do about it. The detection crystal pulsed yellow-green against his palm, a steady heartbeat of confirmation that something was very, very wrong on Privet Drive. And Bill Weasley, who had spent years dismantling ancient curses designed to protect the greatest treasures in magical history, was beginning to suspect he'd found the greatest theft of all. Chapter 2. Egyptian Methods. The front door of number 12. Grimmauld Place felt heavier than usual when Bill pushed it open just past midnight. The detection crystal still pulsed against his ribs where he'd tucked it inside his robes, a steady reminder that the world had shifted during his watch at Privet Drive. Tonks had arrived punctually at 10:30, cheerful and pink-haired, completely unaware that she was now guarding a crime scene. Bill hadn't told her. The words had formed in his throat. Tonks! There's something wrong with the wards. Someone's been draining Harry's magic. But his Cursebreaker's training had silenced them before they could escape. First rule of dealing with unknown curses: gather more information before you start dismantling things. Second rule: trust carefully, because the person who laid the curse might be closer than you think. The house was quiet, most of the Order members having departed after their evening meeting. Bill moved through the dim hallway, past Mrs. Black's curtained portrait, and up the stairs toward the library. His mind was already cataloguing what he needed: texts on ward modification, anything about parasitic enchantments, references to energy siphoning that might explain what he'd detected at Privet Drive. The Black family library occupied 2 full floors of the ancient house, crammed with centuries of accumulated magical knowledge. Most of it was dark, dangerous, or both, exactly what Bill needed right now. If someone had been sophisticated enough to modify Dumbledore's ward work without detection, they were dealing with magic that wouldn't be found in standard defense textbooks. Light was already spilling from beneath the library door when Bill reached the second floor. He paused, hand on the doorknob, wondering who else was conducting midnight research. The Order had been using the library extensively since they'd moved into Grimmauld Place, but most members preferred to do their reading during daylight hours when the shadows didn't seem quite so eager to whisper secrets. He opened the door to find Hermione Granger, surrounded by a fortress of open books, her bushy hair pulled back with what appeared to be a self-inking quill. She looked up as he entered, and Bill was struck by how much older she seemed than when he'd first met her 2 years ago. The bookish 15-year-old had sharpened into someone who approached research like warfare, methodical, relentless, and slightly dangerous. "Bill," she said, closing the volume she'd been reading with a soft thud. "How was your shift?" "Quiet," Bill lied, settling into the chair across from her. "What's keeping you up? Another one of Dumbledore's research projects?" Hermione's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Not exactly. I've been looking into ward theory, actually. Specifically, how protective enchantments interact with each other when they're layered in complex patterns." Bill's heart stuttered. Ward interaction theory? That's pretty advanced stuff. What brought that on? Harry mentioned something about feeling off lately. More tired than usual, even when he's not having nightmares about you-know-who. I thought maybe it had to do with the protective magic around his relative's house. Hermione picked up her quill, twirling it between her fingers. "I know Dumbledore said the blood wards are keeping him safe, but I wanted to understand exactly how they work." The detection crystal against Bill's chest pulsed harder, responding to his surge of adrenaline. Hermione had noticed. She might not have the tools to detect what Bill had found, but her academic mind had caught the symptoms. "What have you found so far?" Bill asked carefully. Hermione gestured to the stack of books around her. "More than I expected, actually. The Black family collected some truly comprehensive texts on blood magic and protective enchantments. Most of it's fairly straightforward. Sacrificial protection, familial anchoring, the standard principles Dumbledore would have used. But there are some references to more complex applications that are troubling, such as parasitic enchantments." Hermione opened one of the larger volumes, revealing pages of spidery handwriting, interspersed with complex magical diagrams. Curses that disguise themselves as protective magic, feeding off the host spell while slowly draining the protected individual. According to this text, they were popular among certain pure-blood families who wanted to weaken their enemies over generations without leaving obvious traces. Bill forced his expression to remain neutral, though every instinct was screaming that they were finally getting somewhere. How would something like that work? The parasitic curse integrates itself into an existing protective ward, usually during the initial casting when the magical framework is most vulnerable. It mimics the resonance of the host protection so perfectly that most detection methods can't distinguish between them. Hermione traced one of the diagrams with her finger. The victim experiences fatigue, reduced magical capacity, sometimes difficulty with spell work that should be well within their abilities. But it happens so gradually that it's easily attributed to other causes. Bill's mouth had gone dry. Harry's struggles with certain subjects, his exhaustion, the way he seemed to work twice as hard as other students for the same results. What if none of that was natural? What if it was the result of 15 years of magical theft? "These parasitic curses," he said, keeping his voice level. "How would you detect them?" "That's the problem. Standard diagnostic spells can't penetrate the mimicry. You'd need specialized detection equipment, the kind used for curse breaking or artifact authentication. The text mentioned something called a resonance mapper that can distinguish between genuine protective magic and parasitic imitations. Hermione looked up at him with sharp, curious eyes. "Why do you ask? Have you seen something like this before?" Bill was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Hermione was brilliant, methodical, and completely devoted to Harry's welfare. She'd also already suspected that something was wrong with the ward structure at Privet Drive, which meant she might be willing to help him investigate further. But she was also 15 years old and had absolute faith in Dumbledore's judgment. Still, he needed allies. And if Hermione had already noticed the symptoms, "I have some detection equipment from my curse-breaking work," he said finally. "Professional-grade instruments that might be able to map magical resonances in more detail than standard spells. If you're concerned about Harry's welfare, maybe we should take a closer look at those protective wards." Hermione's eyes lit up with the particular fervor she reserved for challenging intellectual problems. "You mean actually analyze the ward structure at Privet Drive? Map the magical flows and verify that the protection is functioning as intended?" "Something like that." Bill pulled the folded detection parchment from his robes, smoothing it out on the table between them. "This is a preliminary scan I took earlier tonight. What do you make of it?" Hermione leaned forward, studying the silver threads that mapped the magical flows around number 4 Privet Drive. Her expression grew more troubled as she traced the patterns with her finger. "There are definitely 2 distinct magical signatures here," she said slowly. "The primary ward structure is beautiful. Classic sacrificial protection, elegantly anchored to the family bond. But this secondary pattern?" She frowned, pulling one of the open books closer. "The energy flow is wrong. Protective magic should circulate around the target, creating a shield. But this is flowing away from the house, toward some external destination." "Exactly what I thought." Bill watched her face carefully. "What does that suggest to you?" "That someone has attached a siphoning enchantment to Harry's protection." Hermione's voice was quiet, but Bill could hear the anger building beneath her academic composure. "Someone has been stealing his magic, possibly for years." The relief of having his suspicions confirmed was almost overwhelming. Bill had spent 3 hours convinced he was going mad, that his detection instruments were malfunctioning, that no one would be capable of such systematic cruelty. But Hermione's independent analysis had reached the same conclusion. "The question is who," Bill said, "and how long it's been going on, and how we stop it." Hermione was already reaching for another book, her research instincts kicking into overdrive. These texts mentioned several methods for severing parasitic enchantments, but they all require precise mapping of the curse structure first. We'd need to understand exactly how the siphoning ward is integrated with the blood protection. That's going to require more sophisticated equipment than what I brought tonight. Bill studied the detection parchment again, noting the areas where the silver threads faded beyond the instrument's range. "I have access to a full curse-breaking kit at Gringotts. Resonance mappers, magical spectrometers, ward analysis charts. Everything we'd need for a comprehensive investigation." "How soon can you get them?" "Tomorrow, if I'm careful about it. Most of the equipment is checked out to active projects, but I can probably justify borrowing a few instruments for research purposes without raising suspicions." Bill folded the parchment carefully and tucked it back into his robes. "The real question is whether we should bring this to Dumbledore first." Hermione was quiet for a long moment, chewing on her lower lip in a gesture Bill recognized from watching her help Ron with homework over the years. "I want to say yes," she said finally. "But if someone has been siphoning Harry's magic for 15 years, they had to have access during the initial ward casting. There aren't many people who would have been involved in placing Harry with his relatives." The implication hung between them, like a curse, waiting to detonate. Bill felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what Hermione was suggesting. "You think it might be someone in the Order?" "I think we need more information before we start making accusations," Hermione said, but her voice carried a brittleness that suggested she'd already considered the worst possibilities. "If we're wrong about this, we could destroy people's faith in the Order's leadership. But if we're right, someone has been systematically abusing Harry Potter for more than a decade." Bill stood up, suddenly too restless to remain seated. "Someone who had access to him as a baby, who could modify Dumbledore's ward work, who has been stealing his magical development all these years." "We need proof," Hermione said firmly. "Solid, undeniable evidence before we act on any of this. Can your equipment provide that kind of detailed analysis?" Bill thought about the full arsenal of curse-breaking instruments he had access to at Gringotts. Devices that could trace magical signatures back to their source, that could map energy flows with precision down to individual magical threads, that could determine exactly when and how a ward structure had been modified. "Yes," he said. "If there's a parasitic curse attached to Harry's protection, I can find it. And I can trace where the stolen magic is going." Hermione nodded, closing the books around her with decisive snaps. "Then we go back tomorrow night. Both of us. You handle the technical detection work, and I'll document everything for analysis. We approach this like a proper investigation. Methodical, thorough, and completely secret, until we know exactly what we're dealing with." Bill felt a surge of gratitude for Hermione's practical approach. Her academic training was proving invaluable for organizing what could have become a chaotic emotional response to his discovery. "What about Ron and the others?" "Not yet. The fewer people who know about this, the better." Hermione's expression was grim but determined. "If someone in the Order is responsible for this, we can't risk word getting back to them before we have enough evidence to act." Bill nodded, already mentally cataloguing which instruments he would need from Gringotts and how he could access them without arousing suspicion. Tomorrow night he would return to Privet Drive with the full arsenal of his profession, and this time he wouldn't just detect the parasitic curse, he would trace it back to its source, because someone had been hurting Harry Potter for 15 years, and Bill Weasley was going to find out exactly who. Chapter 3. The Second Layer. The advanced curse-breaking equipment felt familiar against Bill's back as he and Hermione approached Mrs. Fig's garden under cover of darkness. The resonance mapper hummed softly in its protective case, accompanied by the gentle chiming of the magical spectrometer and the weight of 3 different ward analysis crystals that had taken him most of the afternoon to sign out from Gringotts without arousing suspicion. "Curse inventory for the Pembroke Tomb project," he'd told the equipment clerk, a half-truth that still made his stomach clench with guilt. But the alternative, explaining that he suspected someone had been systematically draining Harry Potter's magic for 15 years, would have either gotten him committed to St. Mungo's or triggered an investigation that might alert the wrong people. Hermione carried her own contribution to their midnight investigation, a leather satchel filled with documentation materials, measurement tools, and what appeared to be enough parchment to transcribe the entire contents of the Hogwarts library. Her academic thoroughness had proven invaluable during their planning session earlier that day, turning what could have been a chaotic emotional response into a methodical professional investigation. "Same positions as last night?" she whispered as they settled behind Mrs. Fig's garden wall. "Better," Bill replied, unpacking the resonance mapper with practiced efficiency. "This equipment has a much wider detection range. We can map the entire street from here and get readings on magical signatures up to half a mile away." The resonance mapper was a marvel of goblin engineering, a crystalline device the size of a dinner plate that could detect and analyze magical emanations with precision that put standard wizard detection spells to shame. Bill activated it with a touch, watching as the crystal surface began to glow with shifting patterns of colored light. "What are we seeing?" Hermione asked, pulling out a piece of parchment to begin documenting their findings. "Magical signatures mapped by intensity and type," Bill explained, adjusting the device's sensitivity. Gold threads represent protective magic, silver shows neutral magical residue from everyday spell use, red indicates curse work, and green. He paused as green threads began appearing on the mapper's surface, spreading out from number 4 Privet Drive in a complex web that made his Cursebreaker's instincts scream warnings. Green represents parasitic or draining magic. Bill's voice was grim as he watched the pattern stabilize. And there's a lot more of it than I detected last night. The blood ward around Privet Drive showed clearly on the mapper, a beautiful golden web centered on the house and extending in a protective dome that covered the entire property. But threaded through it, almost indistinguishable from the protective magic, except to equipment this sophisticated, was an intricate network of green threads that pulsed with a rhythm Bill was beginning to find sickeningly familiar. "It's not just siphoning energy," Hermione said, studying the pattern over his shoulder. "Look at the pulse rate. It's synchronized with something." Bill activated the spectrometer, a secondary device that could analyze the temporal characteristics of magical flows. The readings made him feel physically ill. "It's synchronized with emotional distress," he said quietly. "The parasitic magic is strongest when its target is experiencing fear, anger, pain, or despair. It's designed to feed off suffering." Hermione's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet garden. "You mean it gets stronger when Harry is upset?" "More than that." Bill traced the green threads on the mapper's surface with growing horror. "It's designed to encourage emotional distress. Look at these feedback loops. The draining magic creates fatigue and irritability, which makes the victim more likely to become upset, which triggers stronger draining, which creates more fatigue. It's a self-perpetuating cycle." The implications were staggering. Harry's explosive temper during his teenage years, his struggles with depression and anger, his tendency toward emotional isolation. What if none of that was natural adolescent behavior? What if it was the result of a curse specifically designed to amplify negative emotions in order to harvest his magical energy? "Bill," Hermione's voice was strained, "activate the directional tracker. We need to see where all this energy is going." Bill attached the directional component to the resonance mapper, a modification that could trace magical flows back to their source or forward to their destination. The results appeared as silver arrows on the crystal surface, showing the direction of energy movement. Every green thread led away from Privet Drive toward the southeast, converging into a single powerful flow that disappeared beyond the mapper's detection range. But the direction was clear enough to make Bill's blood run cold. "London," he said. "All the drained energy is flowing toward central London. Can you be more specific than that?" Bill consulted the spectrometer readings, cross-referencing the energy signature with known magical locations in London. The answer came back immediately, and he wished desperately that it hadn't. "The energy signature is consistent with the magical resonance around the Ministry of Magic district," he said. "But there are dozens of magical buildings in that area. Without getting closer to the destination point, I can't narrow it down further." Hermione was scribbling notes frantically, documenting every detail of their findings. "What about the temporal analysis? When was this parasitic curse first activated?" Bill activated the chronological detection function, the most sophisticated feature of his borrowed equipment. It could analyze the accumulated magical residue of long-term spells and determine when they had first been cast. The reading that appeared made him feel like he was going to be sick. "October 31st, 1981, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The same night Harry's parents were killed. The parasitic curse was activated within hours of Harry being placed with his relatives. The full scope of what they were dealing with finally crystallized in Bill's mind with devastating clarity. Someone had used the tragedy of James and Lily Potter's deaths as an opportunity to attach a draining curse to their son's protective magic. For nearly 14 years, every moment of Harry's suffering had been literally feeding power to whoever had designed this monstrosity. Whoever did this had access to Harry within hours of Dumbledore placing him at Privet Drive, Hermione said, her academic mind working through the implications, even as her voice shook with suppressed anger. They had to know exactly how the Blood Ward was structured, and they needed the skill to modify it without detection. And they needed a reason to be there that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Bill was thinking like a curse breaker now, analyzing the crime scene with professional detachment because the emotional implications were too horrifying to process directly. Someone who would naturally be involved in checking on Harry's security, who would have legitimate access to the ward structure. Neither of them spoke the obvious conclusion aloud, but it hung between them like a curse, waiting to detonate. There were very few people who fit that description, and all of them were among the most trusted members of the Order of the Phoenix. "We need more information," Hermione said finally. "Before we can act on any of this, we need to identify the specific destination of the drained energy and confirm who has access to it." Bill nodded, carefully packing away the detection equipment. "The directional trace gives us a starting point. If we can get closer to central London with this equipment, we should be able to narrow down the destination to a specific building, maybe even a specific room." And then? Bill looked toward number 4 Privet Drive, where Harry Potter slept peacefully, unaware that his entire childhood had been shaped by invisible magical theft. The house looked so ordinary, so harmless, that it was almost impossible to believe they were looking at the scene of a crime that had been ongoing for nearly 15 years. "Then we find out who's been stealing from a child since he was barely more than a baby," Bill said, and his voice carried the cold fury of a professional who had spent years dismantling ancient curses designed to protect the greatest treasures in the world. "And we make them pay for it." Hermione was quiet as they walked back toward central London, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what they had discovered. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Someone had deliberately, systematically abused Harry Potter for his entire life, using his own protective magic as the mechanism for that abuse. The technical aspects of the curse were brilliant in a horrifying way. By integrating the parasitic magic into the Blood Ward itself, the perpetrator had ensured that any attempt to remove Harry from Privet Drive would be seen as endangering his safety. The very people who cared about Harry's welfare would unknowingly become complicit in maintaining the curse that was slowly destroying him. "Bill?" Hermione said, as they reached the apparition point where they would separate for the night. "What if Dumbledore doesn't know?" It was the question Bill had been trying not to ask himself. What if the man they all trusted, the leader of the Order, the only wizard Voldemort had ever feared, was as much a victim of this deception as Harry himself? "Then we tell him everything we've found and let him help us stop it," Bill replied. "But if he does know, if he knows, then we're on our own." Hermione's voice was steady, but Bill could see the fear in her eyes. "Because if Dumbledore is involved in this, then there's no one else with enough power to stand against him." Bill thought about the readings on his equipment, the 15 years of accumulated magical theft, the careful integration of parasitic magic into protective wards that should have been sacred. Someone with incredible skill and extensive knowledge had done this. Someone who had been trusted with Harry's welfare from the moment he arrived at Privet Drive. Someone who might not be as trustworthy as they had all believed. "We gather more evidence first," he said. "Tomorrow night, we trace the energy flow to its destination. We find out exactly who is receiving Harry's stolen magic, and we document everything. Only then do we decide who we can trust with what we've learned." Hermione nodded, clutching her satchel of documentation like it contained the most precious secrets in the world. Which, Bill reflected grimly, it probably did. Because they had just uncovered evidence of the most devastating betrayal in wizarding history, and somewhere in London, someone was sleeping peacefully on 15 years' worth of stolen power that should have belonged to Harry Potter. Chapter 4. The Paper Trail. The goblin-designed filing system at Gringotts had always struck Bill as both beautiful and terrifying in its precision. Every magical transaction, every contract, every transfer of power or property was recorded in triplicate and stored in archives that stretched back over 1,000 years. What the goblins lacked in warmth, they made up for in their absolute dedication to meticulous record-keeping. Bill had never been more grateful for that obsessive attention to detail than he was now, sitting at his London desk with legitimate access to the bank's magical contract archives. His hands trembled slightly as he signed the access request for Historical Ward Installation Records, 1981, Residential Properties, Research Purposes. The goblin clerk who processed the request didn't even glance up from his ledger, treating it as routine paperwork. If only he knew what Bill was really looking for. The records arrived within minutes, delivered by a cart that moved through the archive tunnels with mechanical efficiency. 3 thick folders containing every magical contract, filed in 1981, involving residential ward installations, protective enchantments, and blood magic applications. Bill's stomach clenched as he opened the first folder and began searching for any mention of Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He found it on page 47 of the second folder. Contract for complex protective enchantments, number 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Client, a PWB Dumbledore. Date of installation, November 2nd, 1981. Bill stared at the contract header for a long moment, forcing himself to breathe steadily. November 2nd was the day after Harry had been placed with his relatives, exactly matching the timeline his equipment had detected, but it was the contract specifications that made his blood run cold. Primary enchantment. Sacrificial blood protection, anchored to maternal family line, duration until subject reaches majority or voluntarily abandons family residence. Standard blood ward protection, exactly as Dumbledore had described to the Order. But there was more. Secondary enchantment, magical energy collection, and redirection system, synchronized to primary ward structure for enhanced protection efficacy. Bill read that line 3 times, his Cursebreaker's training passing the deliberately vague language. Enhanced protection efficacy was bureaucratic doublespeak. What the contract actually described was a magical energy siphoning system designed to harvest power from the ward's protected subject. Tertiary enchantment, emotional resonance amplification to strengthen ward response during periods of increased threat perception. The clinical language couldn't disguise what Bill was reading. Someone had contracted ward specialists to install a system that would amplify Harry's emotional distress in order to harvest more magical energy from him. They had turned a 15-month-old child into a magical battery and disguised it as enhanced protection. The contract was signed by 3 parties: Albus Dumbledore, a ward specialist named Marcus Delacroix, and a goblin witness whose spidery signature was barely legible. But it was the payment structure that made Bill feel sick. Payment: initial installation fee of 500 galleons, ongoing maintenance fee of 50 galleons per month, to be automatically debited from designated account, energy surplus to be credited to client's operational fund at current market rates. Bill's hands were shaking as he opened the 3rd folder, searching for the ongoing transaction records. The goblin's obsessive documentation meant that every monthly payment, every energy credit, every transfer of stolen magical power would be recorded in excruciating detail. The transaction log for the Privet Drive ward system filled 12 pages of closely written figures. 15 years of monthly maintenance payments, 15 years of energy credits, automatically deposited into what the records euphemistically called Client's Operational Fund. The cumulative totals made Bill's vision blur with rage. Over the course of nearly 15 years, the ward system at Privet Drive had generated enough magical energy to power major enchantments worth approximately 15,000 galleons at current market rates. 15,000 galleons worth of magical power, stolen from Harry Potter one day at a time, one moment of fear and anger at a time. Bill cross-referenced the account numbers with Gringotts' client database, though he already knew what he would find. The operational fund receiving the energy credits belonged to Albus Dumbledore, with secondary access granted to something called the Phoenix Trust, obviously the Order's financial foundation. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. The Order of the Phoenix's operational expenses, their safe houses, their equipment, their ability to function as an underground resistance movement, all of it had been funded by magically harvesting the life force of the boy they claimed to be protecting. Bill pushed back from his desk and walked to the window overlooking Diagon Alley, trying to process what he had discovered. Shoppers moved through the street below, going about their daily business, completely unaware that one of the wizarding world's most respected leaders had been systematically stealing from a child for over a decade. The documentation was ironclad. Dumbledore hadn't just known about the energy siphoning, he had commissioned it. He had paid ward specialists to design and install a system that would harvest Harry's magical development to fund his political agenda. He had turned Harry Potter into an unwilling source of revenue for the Order of the Phoenix. Bill thought about all the times Dumbledore had spoken about Harry's welfare, his repeated insistence that the blood wards were necessary for the boy's safety. Every word had been a lie, wrapped around a kernel of truth. The blood wards were keeping Harry safe from Voldemort, but only so that his magical energy could continue being stolen to fund the fight against that same dark wizard. The worst part was how perfectly it all fit together. Harry's isolation at Privet Drive wasn't just about blood protection. It was about ensuring that he remained in proximity to the siphoning ward. His emotional struggles weren't just the result of abuse and trauma. They were being artificially amplified to generate more harvestable magical energy. His difficulties with certain subjects at school weren't signs of limited ability. They were symptoms of having 30% of his magical development stolen before he could use it. Bill's professional ethics warred with everything he had believed about the Order's mission. As a curse breaker, he had spent years dismantling magical systems designed to steal power from innocent victims. He had seen the devastation that energy siphoning could cause, the way it could slowly drain someone's life force until they withered away to nothing. The idea that someone he respected, someone he had trusted with his family's safety, could deliberately inflict that kind of harm on a child. A soft knock on his office door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Bill quickly closed the contract folders and shoved them into his desk drawer before calling for the visitor to enter. "Bill?" Hermione Granger peered around the door, carrying a stack of books that probably weighed more than she did. "I hope you don't mind me visiting you at work, but I had some questions about what we discovered last night." Bill glanced around to ensure they were alone, then gestured for her to close the door behind her. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that required a trip to the Hogwarts library." Hermione set her books down on his desk with a heavy thud. "I've been researching the legal implications of unauthorized magical energy harvesting, and I think we might have grounds for a formal complaint with the Wizengamot." "Hermione," Bill said quietly, "I need to show you something. But first, you need to promise me that what I'm about to share doesn't leave this room until we decide how to handle it." Something in his tone made her expression sharpen with concern. "What did you find?" Bill pulled the contract folders from his desk drawer and spread them open on the surface between them. The original installation contracts for the Privet Drive ward system, and the ongoing transaction records showing exactly where Harry's stolen magical energy has been going. Hermione leaned forward, scanning the contract specifications with the same intensity she brought to her most challenging coursework. Bill watched her expression change from curiosity to horror, to cold, analytical rage as she processed what she was reading. "These energy credits," she said, pointing to the transaction log, "they're being deposited into Dumbledore's accounts? His operational fund, which appears to be the primary funding source for Order activities." Bill felt sick saying it aloud. "Hermione, the Order of the Phoenix has been financed by stealing Harry's magical development for 15 years. Hermione was quiet for a long time, studying the documentation with the methodical thoroughness that had made her the brightest witch of her generation. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of fury that made Bill's protective instincts flare. "He's been using Harry as a source of funding while claiming to protect him," she said. "Every meeting at Grimmauld Place, every order mission, every piece of equipment, all of it paid for with magical energy stolen from the boy we're supposedly fighting to defend." "The documentation is clear," Bill agreed. "This wasn't an accident or an oversight. Dumbledore specifically contracted ward specialists to design a system that would harvest Harry's power while disguising it as enhanced protection." Hermione closed the folders carefully and sat back in her chair, her academic mind clearly working through the implications. "We need legal counsel," she said finally. "Someone with expertise in magical contract law who can advise us on the proper procedure for filing formal charges." "Charges against Dumbledore?" Bill felt a chill at the prospect. "Hermione, he's one of the most powerful wizards alive. Even with this evidence, who's going to believe that Albus Dumbledore would steal magical energy from Harry Potter?" "Everyone who sees this documentation," Hermione replied firmly. "The goblins keep meticulous records, and goblin testimony is considered unimpeachable in wizarding law. We have contracts signed by Dumbledore himself, transaction records spanning 15 years, and technical specifications that clearly describe energy siphoning enchantments." Bill thought about the implications of exposing Dumbledore's crimes to the wizarding public. The Order of the Phoenix would collapse. The resistance against Voldemort would be crippled just when it was needed most. Harry would learn that the man he trusted most had been systematically betraying him since infancy. But the alternative was allowing the magical theft to continue, pretending they didn't know that Harry Potter was being slowly drained of his life force to fund a war effort that claimed to be protecting him. "What do you recommend we do?" Bill asked. Hermione gathered her books, her expression grim but determined. "We document everything. We make copies of these records. We research the legal procedures for filing charges against a sitting member of the Wizengamot, and then we give Dumbledore one chance to explain himself before we bring the full weight of wizarding law down on his head." Bill nodded, already thinking about how to copy the sensitive banking records without triggering Gringotts's security protocols. "And if his explanation isn't satisfactory, then we destroy him," Hermione said simply, "because no one, not even Albus Dumbledore, has the right to steal a child's future for their own purposes, no matter how noble those purposes might seem." As Hermione left his office, Bill sat alone, with the evidence of the most devastating betrayal in wizarding history spread across his desk. Somewhere in London, Dumbledore was probably planning order strategy, making decisions about how to protect Harry Potter, while continuing to profit from the systematic theft of that same boy's magical development. But not for much longer, because Bill Weasley had spent years dismantling curses designed to steal power from innocent victims, and he was about to apply all that expertise to dismantling the most sophisticated magical theft in wizarding history, even if it meant bringing down the only wizard Voldemort had ever feared. Chapter 5. The Harvesting Ward. Bill had brought every quantification instrument Gringotts possessed, borrowing equipment from 3 different departments under the pretext of a comprehensive ward efficiency analysis for insurance purposes. The Goblin quartermasters had barely glanced at his requisition forms, accustomed to curse breakers requesting exotic equipment for fieldwork. They had no idea he was about to use their most precise measurement tools to document the greatest crime in wizarding history. Mrs. Figg's garden had become his temporary laboratory, transformed into a monitoring station that would have impressed the researchers at the Department of Mysteries. Energy quantifiers hummed softly in the darkness, measuring magical flows down to individual thaumic units. Temporal analysis crystals tracked patterns across time, mapping the ebb and flow of the energy theft with precision that made Bill's earlier detection work look primitive by comparison. The readings were worse than he had imagined. The basic energy siphoning that he and Hermione had detected was just the foundation layer of a far more sophisticated system. Bill's enhanced equipment revealed at least 6 different harvesting mechanisms integrated into the ward structure, each one designed to activate under specific circumstances to maximize the theft of Harry's magical development. The baseline siphoning drew approximately 15 thaumic units per day from Harry's ambient magical field, enough to cause chronic fatigue and reduced spell efficacy, but subtle enough to be attributed to natural variation in magical ability. But that was nothing compared to what happened during episodes of emotional distress or accidental magic. Bill activated the historical analysis function, cross-referencing the energy quantifiers with temporal mapping crystals that could reconstruct magical patterns from residual traces. The results made him physically ill. Every major episode of accidental magic in Harry's childhood had triggered massive energy harvesting surges. The glass vanishing incident at the zoo when Harry was 11 had generated nearly 800 thaumic units in a single afternoon, more magical energy than most adult wizards produced in a month. The Flying Ford Anglia incident at Hogwarts had created a feedback loop that siphoned over 1,200 units across several days as Harry's magical core tried to recover from the trauma. But it was the pattern analysis that revealed the true horror of what had been done. The energy spikes weren't random. They followed a predictable pattern that correlated directly with known episodes of abuse from Harry's relatives. Every time Vernon Dursley had lost his temper, every time Dudley had engaged in particularly vicious bullying, every time Petunia had subjected Harry to emotional cruelty, the magical harvesting had intensified dramatically. Bill's hands shook as he cross-referenced the energy patterns with what he knew about Harry's childhood. The cupboard under the stairs, the bars on his bedroom windows, the systematic isolation and emotional abuse. None of it had been incidental cruelty. It had all been designed to trigger the kind of emotional distress that would amplify the magical harvesting. The Dursleys hadn't just been abusive relatives, they had been unwitting accomplices in a systematic program of magical theft that had been specifically designed to feed off their nephew's suffering. Bill activated the cumulative analysis program, feeding 15 years of energy patterns into goblin-designed algorithms that could calculate total magical development theft with accounting-level precision. The numbers that appeared on his measurement crystal made him lean against Mrs. Figg's garden wall for support. 37%. Over the course of 15 years, 37% of Harry Potter's magical development had been stolen through the siphoning ward system. Bill thought about Harry's struggles with potions, his difficulties with theoretical magic, his tendency to exhaust himself more quickly than other students during practical spell work. What if none of that reflected natural limitations? What if it was all symptoms of having more than a third of his magical capacity drained away before he could develop it? The boy who had survived the killing curse, who had faced down Voldemort multiple times, who had been hailed as one of the most magically powerful wizards of his generation, he had done all of that while operating at barely 2/3 of his natural capacity. Bill ran the calculations again, checking his methodology, hoping desperately that he had made an error. But the goblin instruments were precise to within hundredths of a thaumic unit. There was no mistake. Harry Potter should have been one of the most magically powerful wizards in centuries. Instead, he had been systematically weakened from infancy, turned into a magical battery to power the very organization that claimed to be protecting him. The measurement crystals chimed softly, indicating that they had detected fresh magical activity. Bill looked up to see lights flickering in the windows of number 4 Privet Drive. The Dursleys were awake, probably engaged in one of their frequent late-night arguments. Vernon's voice carried across the quiet suburban street, raised in anger about something trivial. Bill watched in horrified fascination as his energy quantifiers began registering increased activity from the siphoning ward. Even with Harry miles away at Grimmauld Place, the system was still active, still programmed to harvest magical energy from any source of emotional distress in the house. The ward had become so sophisticated, so deeply integrated into the property's magical infrastructure, that it was feeding off the ambient emotional turmoil of the entire household. For 15 years, every moment of fear, anger, Frustration or despair that had occurred in that house had been converted into stolen magical power and funneled directly to Dumbledore's accounts. The Dursleys' chronic unhappiness, their constant conflicts, their systematic cruelty toward Harry, all of it had been literally profitable for the Order of the Phoenix. Bill thought about the financial records he had discovered at Gringotts, the thousands of galleons worth of stolen magical energy that had funded Order operations over the years. Every safe house, every piece of equipment, every covert operation had been paid for with Harry's stolen childhood. The boy had been turned into an unwilling source of revenue for his own protection. Bill's curse-breaking training had exposed him to some of the most sophisticated magical theft systems in wizarding history. He had dismantled curses designed by ancient pharaohs to steal the life force of grave robbers. He had analyzed ward systems created by dark wizards to drain power from entire communities. But he had never encountered anything as methodical, as comprehensive, as devastatingly effective as what had been done to Harry Potter. This wasn't just magical theft. It was systematic magical malnutrition, deliberately imposed on a child from infancy and maintained throughout his entire development. Harry had been starved of his own magical potential, while being told that his stunted growth was natural, that his struggles were normal, that his limitations were simply the result of his circumstances. Bill activated his communication mirror, the goblin-made device that allowed secure contact with Hermione back at Grimmauld Place. Her face appeared in the reflective surface within moments, clearly having been waiting for his report. "What did you find?" she asked without preamble. "It's worse than we thought," Bill said, his voice hoarse from hours of silent horror. "The energy theft isn't just opportunistic. It's designed to feed off suffering. The Dursleys' abuse has been amplifying the magical harvesting for 15 years. Hermione's expression hardened as Bill explained his findings, sharing the quantification data and the pattern analysis that revealed the systematic nature of the abuse. When he reached the calculation showing 37% theft of Harry's magical development, she was quiet for a long time. "So Harry is operating at barely 2/3 of his natural magical capacity," she said finally. "Everything he's accomplished, surviving Voldemort, excelling at defense against the dark arts, performing magic that impresses even the professors, he's done all of that while being systematically drained of his own power. And it explains everything else," Bill continued. "His difficulties with theoretical magic, his struggles in potions, the way he exhausts himself more quickly than other students. It's not a natural limitation, it's malnutrition. He's been magically starved since infancy." Hermione's academic mind was clearly working through the implications. If we could break the siphoning ward, if we could restore his full magical capacity, he would be one of the most powerful wizards alive, Bill finished. Maybe the most powerful. The boy who survived the killing curse while operating at 2/3 capacity? If he had access to his full magical development, he could end this war, Hermione said quietly. Voldemort wouldn't stand a chance against a wizard operating at Harry's true potential. Bill looked back at number 4 Privet Drive, where the lights were finally going out as the Dursleys settled down for another night of restless sleep. The energy quantifiers continued their soft humming, documenting the ongoing theft that would continue until someone with the skill and knowledge to dismantle it decided to act. Which is exactly why Dumbledore has kept him weakened, Bill realized. A magically stunted Harry Potter is easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to sacrifice when the time comes. But a Harry Potter operating at his full potential might start asking uncomfortable questions about why he's been kept weak all these years. Hermione's reflection nodded grimly. "We have to break the ward. Not just document it, not just expose it. We have to actively dismantle the entire system and restore Harry's magical capacity." "That's curse-breaking work at the highest level," Bill warned. "Dismantling a ward system this sophisticated without destroying the legitimate blood protection will require precision that most curse breakers couldn't manage. And if we make a mistake, we could leave Harry vulnerable to Voldemort, Hermione finished. But if we do nothing, we're complicit in 15 years of systematic abuse that's deliberately weakened the one person who might be able to end this war. Bill deactivated his measurement equipment, carefully packing the instruments that had revealed the scope of the greatest crime in wizarding history. Tomorrow, he would return to Gringotts and document every detail of his findings. He would create an unassailable record of magical theft and systematic abuse that could bring down even Albus Dumbledore. But tonight, he sat in Mrs. Figg's garden and grieved for a 15-year-old boy who had never been allowed to discover his true magical potential because the adults who claimed to love him had been too afraid of what he might become. Harry Potter deserved better than being turned into a magical battery for the greater good, and Bill Weasley was going to make sure he got it, even if it meant dismantling the entire power structure of the wizarding world to do it. The energy quantifiers gave one final chime before going silent, having completed their documentation of the most sophisticated magical theft in wizarding history. In a few hours, Bill would begin the process of tearing it all down, and then Harry Potter would finally discover what he was truly capable of. Chapter 6. The choice Bill had always prided himself on his loyalty. Loyalty to family, loyalty to friends, loyalty to principles that had guided him through the most dangerous tombs in Egypt without compromising his integrity. But as he sat in his cramped Gringotts office the morning after his devastating discovery at Privet Drive, Bill found himself facing a choice that would test every moral conviction he had ever held. On one side lay his loyalty to the Order of the Phoenix, to Albus Dumbledore, to the man who had recruited him to fight against the greatest dark wizard in a century. Dumbledore had trusted him with dangerous missions, had valued his curse-breaking expertise, had welcomed him into the inner circle of the resistance movement. The idea of betraying that trust felt like tearing out a piece of his own soul. On the other side lay his loyalty to Harry Potter, not just as the boy who lived, but as a 15-year-old boy who had been systematically abused and magically starved since infancy by the very people who claimed to protect him. Harry, who had endured 15 years of deliberate suffering to fund the organization that was supposed to be fighting for his welfare. Bill spread the technical documentation across his desk, trying to focus on the professional challenge rather than the emotional implications. Dismantling the siphoning ward while preserving the blood protection would require curse-breaking work at the absolute pinnacle of the profession. One mistake, one miscalculation, and Harry would be left defenseless against Voldemort. The ward removal techniques in his reference texts were designed for simple magical structures, single-purpose enchantments that could be severed cleanly without affecting surrounding magic. But what had been done to Harry was architectural, not mechanical. The siphoning system was so thoroughly integrated into the blood ward that removing it would be like trying to extract specific stones from the foundation of a building without causing the entire structure to collapse. Bill pulled out his most advanced technical manuals, texts that he had studied during his final year of Curse Breaker certification. The theoretical framework was clear enough. Parasitic enchantments could be severed from host spells using resonance disruption techniques, provided the Cursebreaker had precise knowledge of both magical structures and access to sophisticated ward manipulation tools. The practical application was terrifying. He would need to map every thread of the siphoning system, identify every integration point with the blood protection, and then systematically disconnect the parasitic magic while maintaining the structural integrity of the protective ward. It would require hours of delicate work, performed on-site at Privet Drive, with no margin for error and no possibility of a second attempt, and he would need help. Bill had learned early in his career that the most dangerous, curse-breaking work was never attempted alone. Complex ward manipulations required multiple sets of eyes, multiple perspectives, multiple fallback plans for when the primary approach inevitably encountered unexpected complications. But asking for help meant bringing additional people into a conspiracy against one of the most powerful wizards alive. The question was, who he could trust with knowledge that could destroy the Order of the Phoenix and potentially cripple the resistance against Voldemort. His first instinct was to approach his father, but Arthur Weasley's unwavering faith in Dumbledore would make him a poor choice for a mission that required acting against the headmaster's interests. Ron was too young, too emotionally involved, too likely to do something impulsive that could endanger everyone. His other brothers were either unavailable or unsuited for work this delicate, which left the other members of the Order. Bill considered each of them systematically, applying the analytical methods he used to evaluate curse-breaking partners for high-risk missions. Tonks was skilled but inexperienced with ward work. Mad-Eye Moody was competent but absolutely loyal to Dumbledore. Kingsley Shacklebolt was trustworthy but worked for the Ministry, which created complications. Molly Weasley would never act against Dumbledore's wishes, especially if she believed it endangered Harry. But there was one Order member whose loyalty ran deeper to Harry personally than to Dumbledore institutionally. One person who had already expressed private concerns about some of the headmaster's more questionable decisions. Remus Lupin. Bill had observed Lupin carefully during Order meetings over the past few weeks, noting the werewolf's conflicted reactions to some of Dumbledore's strategic choices. Lupin's loyalty to Harry was absolute. The boy represented his last connection to James and Lily Potter, the friends whose deaths had haunted him for 15 years. But his relationship with Dumbledore was more complicated, marked by gratitude for past support, but also resentment over years of exclusion and the systematic denial of opportunities that had defined his adult life. More importantly, Lupin had the magical knowledge to understand the technical aspects of what had been done to Harry, and the personal investment to act decisively once he understood the scope of the abuse. Bill activated his communication mirror, checking to ensure that his office door was warded against eavesdropping before calling Lupin's emergency contact frequency. The werewolf's scarred face appeared in the reflective surface within moments, concern evident in his amber eyes. "Bill, is everything all right? You look terrible. I need to meet with you privately," Bill said without preamble. "Tonight, if possible. There's something about Harry that you need to know, something that can't wait for the next Order meeting." Lupin's expression sharpened. "What kind of something?" "The kind that would be considered treason if the wrong people overheard us discussing it," Bill replied carefully. "Can you meet me at the Leaky Cauldron around 8? Private booth in the back?" There was a long pause as Lupin evaluated the request, clearly recognizing the gravity in Bill's tone. "Should I be concerned about your mental state, Bill? Because what you're describing sounds dangerously close to questioning Dumbledore's judgment," Bill finished. "Yes, it does. Because I have evidence that the man we've all been trusting with Harry's welfare has been systematically betraying that trust for 15 years. Lupin was quiet for several seconds, his expression cycling through disbelief, concern, and a growing wariness that suggested Bill's words had struck a nerve. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Evidence of what, exactly? Evidence that Harry Potter has been the victim of magical abuse since infancy, and that certain members of the Order have not only known about it, but actively profited from it." Bill watched Lupin's face carefully, looking for any sign that the werewolf might already know or suspect what had been done. Evidence that might explain why Harry has struggled with certain aspects of his magical education, despite demonstrating extraordinary power in other areas. The implications registered immediately in Lupin's eyes. As Harry's former defense professor, he had observed the boy's magical strengths and weaknesses more closely than most Order members. He would understand what Bill was suggesting. 8 o'clock, Lupin said quietly. "Private booth. And Bill, if what you're suggesting is true, then we're not just talking about treason against Dumbledore. We're talking about justice for Harry." Bill nodded, ending the communication and leaning back in his chair. The choice had been made. Within a few hours, he would share his evidence with someone who had the knowledge and motivation to help him act on it. There would be no going back after that conversation. No pretending he hadn't uncovered evidence of systematic magical abuse. No maintaining his comfortable loyalty to an organization that had been funded by a child's stolen future. He spent the remainder of the day finalizing his technical analysis, creating documentation that would be compelling to someone with Lupin's magical education. The evidence was overwhelming. Contract records, financial transactions, energy quantification data, and ward analysis that painted a clear picture of 15 years of deliberate abuse disguised as protection. By the time Bill left Gringotts that evening, he had committed himself to a course of action that would either restore Harry Potter's stolen magical potential or destroy everything Bill had believed about the people he had trusted to lead the fight against darkness. The Leaky Cauldron was crowded with the usual evening clientele when Bill arrived, but he had reserved a booth in the back corner that was warded for privacy and enhanced with silencing charms that would prevent their conversation from being overheard. Remus was already waiting, nursing a butterbeer and looking more serious than Bill had ever seen him. "Before you tell me anything," Lupin said, as Bill settled into the booth across from him, "I need you to understand what you're asking of me. If you're about to show me evidence that Dumbledore has harmed Harry in some way, you're asking me to choose between my gratitude to the man who gave me a chance at a normal life and my loyalty to the son of my closest friends." "I understand that," Bill replied, pulling out the folders containing his evidence. "And I need you to understand what I'm risking by sharing this with you. If you decide that loyalty to Dumbledore is more important than Harry's welfare, I'll probably end up in Azkaban for treason against the Order." Lupin nodded slowly. "Then we both understand the stakes. Show me what you've found." Bill spread the documentation across the table between them. Contract records from Gringotts, technical analysis from his curse-breaking equipment, energy quantification data that detailed 15 years of systematic magical theft. He watched Lupin's expression change as the werewolf processed each piece of evidence, his academic mind working through the implications with the same methodical approach he had brought to his teaching. When Lupin finally spoke, his voice was hoarse with suppressed fury. 37% of his magical development for 15 years, and Dumbledore commissioned this system personally. "The financial records are clear," Bill confirmed. "The Order of the Phoenix has been funded primarily through the systematic theft of Harry's magical energy. Every safe house, every piece of equipment, every covert operation, all of it paid for with power stolen from the boy we claim to be protecting." Lupin was quiet for a long time, staring at the evidence with an expression that cycled between grief, rage, and devastating understanding. When he looked up at Bill, his amber eyes carried a hardness that spoke of decisions made and lines crossed. "What do you need from me?" "Help dismantling the siphoning ward without destroying the blood protection," Bill said. "Technical assistance, magical support, and someone to watch my back while I'm performing curse-breaking work that will probably take most of a night to complete safely." "And after we've restored Harry's magical potential?" Bill gathered the documentation carefully, already committed to a path that would change everything. "Then we make sure everyone knows exactly what Albus Dumbledore did to Harry Potter, and we let the wizarding world decide whether a man who would steal a child's magical future for his own purposes deserves to continue leading the fight against darkness." Lupin nodded, extending his hand across the table. "Then we'd better get started. Because Harry Potter has been stolen from long enough." As Bill shook Lupin's hand, he felt the weight of 15 years of accumulated betrayal settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow night, they would begin the most dangerous curse-breaking work of his career. And when they were finished, Harry Potter would finally discover what he was truly capable of, even if it brought down the most powerful wizard alive in the process. Chapter 7. Gathering Allies. Bill had never appreciated the strategic value of Grimmauld Place's many private rooms until he found himself needing to conduct seditious meetings under Dumbledore's nose. The library on the second floor with its heavy doors and built-in silencing charms designed to contain the whispers of dark magic texts, had become their unofficial headquarters for planning what amounted to a conspiracy against the most powerful wizard alive. Remus sat across from him, spreading the complete evidence file across the ancient mahogany table with the methodical care of a former professor organizing lesson materials. The night's revelation at the Leaky Cauldron had transformed the werewolf from a cautious ally into a committed revolutionary, his loyalty to Harry's welfare overriding 15 years of gratitude toward Dumbledore. "The financial documentation is the most damning," Remus said, reviewing the Gringotts transaction records for the third time that morning. "These aren't administrative errors or misunderstandings. They're detailed contracts for the systematic theft of a child's magical development." Bill nodded, watching Remus's scarred face as the former defense professor processed the full scope of what had been done to his former student. "The technical analysis confirms it. Harry has been operating at barely 2/3 of his natural magical capacity for his entire life. Everything he's accomplished, surviving Voldemort, excelling at defense, performing magic that impresses even experienced wizards, he's done while being systematically drained of his own power. And it explains so much about his struggles," Remus continued, his voice heavy with a combination of rage and grief. "His difficulties with theoretical magic, his exhaustion after extended spell work, the way he seems to hit limitations that other students don't experience. I attributed it to his difficult home life and irregular magical education, but it was malnutrition. Deliberate magical starvation." A soft knock on the library door interrupted their review session. Bill quickly activated the room's privacy wards before calling for the visitor to enter. Tonks peered around the door, her hair shifting from pink to a subdued brown that reflected her serious mood. "Remus mentioned you wanted to speak with me about something involving Harry? Something that required complete discretion?" Bill and Remus exchanged glances. They had agreed the previous night that expanding their alliance would be necessary to safely dismantle the ward system at Privet Drive, but choosing who to trust remained a delicate balance between operational needs and security concerns. "Close the door and activate your personal privacy charms," Bill said. "What we're about to show you constitutes evidence of crimes that could bring down the leadership of the Order of the Phoenix." Tonks's expression sharpened immediately, her aura training recognizing the gravity of Bill's tone. She sealed the room with professional efficiency before settling into the chair beside Remus. "What kind of crimes?" "The systematic magical abuse of Harry Potter," Remus said, without preamble. "Ongoing for 15 years, commissioned and funded by Albus Dumbledore, disguised as enhanced protection, but actually designed to steal Harry's magical development to fund Order operations." The silence that followed was absolute. Tonks stared at them both, her metamorphmagus abilities betraying her shock as her hair shifted through several colors before settling on a pale, nearly white shade that made her look suddenly fragile. That's not possible," she said finally. "Dumbledore would never harm Harry. He's devoted his life to protecting that boy." Bill spread the evidence across the table: contracts, financial records, energy quantification data, technical analysis that painted a comprehensive picture of 15 years of systematic abuse. He watched Tonks's expression change as she applied her aura training to evaluate the documentation, her professional objectivity warring with her personal disbelief. "These contracts," she said, pointing to the ward installation specifications, "they're written in legal language designed to obscure the true nature of what's being commissioned. Magical energy collection and redirection system, and emotional resonance amplification. That's not protection enhancement, that's theft and abuse." "The financial records show ongoing payments for 15 years, Remus added. "Every month, magical energy worth hundreds of galleons has been automatically transferred from the Privet Drive ward system to accounts controlled by Dumbledore." Tonks's aura training kicked in fully as she began analyzing the evidence with professional methodology. "The cumulative value of the theft approaches 15,000 galleons. That's grand larceny by wizarding law, even before considering the additional charges for magical abuse of a minor, unauthorized modification of protective enchantments, and fraud. "What kind of legal exposure are we talking about?" Bill asked. "For Dumbledore? Life imprisonment in Azkaban." Tonks replied grimly. "Magical abuse of a minor carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. Systematic theft over 15 years would add another decade. Factor in his position of authority and the breach of trust involved, and he'd never see freedom again." The implications hung between them, like a curse waiting to detonate. They were discussing not just exposing Dumbledore's crimes, but potentially destroying the one person the wizarding world believed could stand against Voldemort. "There's someone else who needs to see this," Remus said quietly. "Someone whose investment in Harry's welfare is even more personal than ours." Bill knew immediately who he meant. Sirius. Harry's godfather, last of the Potter family line, and someone who has already expressed concerns about some of Dumbledore's more questionable decisions regarding Harry's welfare, Remus confirmed. "If anyone has the right to know that Harry has been systematically abused under Dumbledore's direction, it's Sirius." Tonks nodded slowly. "And his legal standing as Harry's godfather gives him the authority to act on this information in ways that we couldn't. He could demand a formal investigation, could file charges with the Wizengamot, could invoke ancient family magic laws to protect Harry from further abuse." Bill carefully gathered the evidence, his curse-breaker's instincts warning him that they were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Once Sirius Black learned that Dumbledore had been systematically stealing from his godson for 15 years, there would be no containing the explosion that followed. They found Sirius in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and glaring at the morning edition of the Daily Prophet. The newspaper's continued campaign of character assassination against Harry had put Sirius in a perpetually foul mood, his protective instincts triggered by every headline that portrayed his godson as delusional or dangerous. "Sirius," Remus said, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to speak with you privately. About Harry." Something in Remus's tone made Sirius look up sharply, his grey eyes immediately alert. "What's happened? Is he hurt? Has Dumbledore decided on another of his brilliant strategies for keeping Harry safe?" The bitterness in that last word suggested that Sirius's faith in Dumbledore's judgment regarding Harry's welfare had already been strained to its limits. Bill realized that their revelation might not come as the shock they had expected. Sirius had already been questioning the headmaster's methods. "Not hurt, exactly," Bill said, activating privacy charms around the kitchen. "But we have evidence that Harry has been the victim of systematic magical abuse for his entire life. Abuse that has been commissioned, funded, and concealed by Albus Dumbledore." The change in Sirius's demeanor was immediate and terrifying. The casual slouch vanished, replaced by the predatory stillness of a man who had survived 12 years in Azkaban by learning to channel rage into deadly focus. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that had once made him one of the most feared members of the Order. "Show me." Bill spread the evidence across the kitchen table, explaining each document as Sirius absorbed the details with the intensity of a man building a case for murder. The Godfather's expression grew more murderous with each revelation. The contracts that had turned Harry into a magical battery, the financial records showing years of stolen energy funding, Order operations, the technical analysis revealing that Harry had been operating at 2/3 capacity his entire life. When Bill reached the calculation showing 37% magical development theft, Sirius was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but carried enough fury to make the kitchen's ancient walls seem to vibrate with tension. "He's been stealing from Harry since he was 15 months old. Every moment of suffering at Privet Drive, every struggle at Hogwarts, every limitation Harry has experienced, all of it designed to feed magical energy to the man who claims to be protecting him." "The Dursley abuse wasn't incidental," Tonks added. "It was engineered to trigger emotional distress that would amplify the magical harvesting. They've been unwitting accomplices in a program of systematic abuse. Sirius stood up from the table, beginning to pace the kitchen with the restless energy of a caged predator. James and Lily died believing their son would be safe. They trusted Dumbledore to protect Harry, to give him the chance at a normal life that they couldn't provide. Instead, he's been turned into a magical battery to fund Dumbledore's political agenda. The blood wards are genuine, Remus said carefully. Harry has been protected from Voldemort, but that protection came at the cost of systematic magical theft that has stunted his development and funded the very organization claiming to fight for his welfare. Protected, so he could be harvested more efficiently, Sirius snarled. Kept alive and magically accessible so Dumbledore could continue stealing from him year after year. Bill watched the interplay between fury and calculation in Sirius's expression, recognizing the moment when raw anger crystallized into operational planning. What do you want to do about it? I want to restore Harry's full magical potential, Sirius said immediately. Whatever it takes, however dangerous it is, we dismantle that siphoning system and give Harry back the power that's been stolen from him. And then? Tonks asked. Sirius's smile was sharp and cold. Then we make sure everyone knows exactly what Albus Dumbledore did to the boy who lived. Every Order member, every Ministry official, every citizen of the Wizarding world. We destroy him so completely that his name becomes synonymous with the betrayal of everything he claimed to stand for. That could cripple the resistance against Voldemort, Remus warned. The resistance has been built on stolen power taken from a child, Sirius replied. If it can't survive without continuing to abuse Harry, then it doesn't deserve to exist. Bill felt a surge of relief that Sirius's response aligned with his own moral instincts. The practical complications of exposing Dumbledore during wartime were significant, but the alternative, allowing the abuse to continue, was unconscionable. We need to move quickly, Tonks said, her aura training focusing on operational considerations. If Dumbledore suspects that we know about the ward system, he might modify it in ways that make dismantling more dangerous, or he might relocate Harry somewhere we can't reach him. How long do we have? Sirius asked. Bill thought about the technical complexity of the ward removal work they were planning. Dismantling the siphoning system safely will require at least 6 hours of uninterrupted work at Privet Drive. We need a night when Dumbledore and his most loyal supporters are occupied elsewhere, and we need Harry to be somewhere safe while we're working on his protection. Tomorrow night, Sirius said decisively. Dumbledore has a meeting with the Minister that's expected to run late. Most of the senior Order members will be occupied with their own assignments. That gives us the window we need. Remus nodded slowly. And if something goes wrong? If we damage the blood protection while removing the siphoning ward? Then we deal with the consequences, Sirius replied. But I won't allow Harry to spend one more day being magically drained to fund the organization that's supposed to be protecting him. As they began planning the most dangerous curse-breaking operation of Bill's career, he realized that they had crossed the point of no return. Tomorrow night, they would either restore Harry Potter's stolen magical potential or destroy the ward system that had kept him alive since infancy. Either way, the truth about what Dumbledore had done to Harry would finally be exposed, and the Wizarding world would learn that sometimes the greatest betrayals came from those who claimed to love us most. Chapter 8. The Plan. The ancient dining room at Grimmauld Place had been transformed into a war room, its long mahogany table covered with curse-breaking manuals, ward analysis charts, and technical diagrams that would have been incomprehensible to anyone without advanced magical engineering training. Bill worked with the methodical precision that had kept him alive in the most dangerous tombs of Egypt, designing a procedure that would either restore Harry's stolen magical potential or destroy the very protection that had kept him alive for 15 years. The primary challenge is structural integration, Bill explained, pointing to a complex diagram that showed the interweaving of the blood protection and siphoning systems. The parasitic ward isn't simply attached to the blood magic. It's grown into it like a vine through a trellis. Cutting it away without damaging the host protection will require sequential disconnection at 17 different integration points. Sirius leaned over the diagram, his grey eyes following the intricate patterns that mapped 15 years of magical theft. How long will the entire procedure take? 6 to 8 hours of continuous work, assuming optimal conditions, Bill replied. I'll need to disconnect each integration point individually, test the structural integrity of the remaining protection, and recalibrate the ward's magical resonance to compensate for the missing parasitic elements. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the entire protective structure could collapse. Tonks studied a secondary diagram showing energy flow patterns. What happens to Harry during the removal process? Will he experience any physical effects from having his magical capacity suddenly restored? That's one of the biggest unknowns, Bill admitted. Theoretical models suggest that restored magical capacity would manifest gradually over several days as his magical core adapts to operating at full strength. But there's also a possibility of magical shock, a sudden influx of power that his system isn't prepared to handle. Remus looked up from the medical texts he had been consulting. I've been researching cases of magical restoration after prolonged suppression. The literature suggests that gradual restoration is safer than immediate full capacity. But the longest documented case of magical suppression was only 3 years. We're dealing with 15 years of systematic theft. There's no precedent for what Harry might experience. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Bill's shoulders. They were planning to perform experimental medical magic on a 15-year-old boy, with no guarantee that the restoration process wouldn't cause more harm than the original theft. But the alternative, allowing the systematic abuse to continue, was unconscionable. We'll monitor him continuously during the removal process, Bill decided. If there are signs of magical shock or system overload, we can pause the procedure and restore the siphoning temporarily while his magical core adjusts. Temporarily? Sirius's voice carried a warning. You're not suggesting we put that damned thing back if the removal proves difficult. I'm suggesting we prioritize Harry's survival over the speed of his recovery, Bill replied firmly. Restoring his magical potential is important, but not at the cost of his life. If we need to remove the siphoning in stages over several months to ensure his safety, then that's what we do. The room fell silent as they contemplated the complexity of what they were attempting. This wasn't just curse-breaking work. It was magical medical intervention on a scale that would challenge the healers at St. Mungo's. There's another consideration we haven't discussed, Remus said quietly. How do we tell Harry what's been done to him? How do we explain that the man he trusts most has been systematically stealing his magical development since infancy? The psychological implications were as daunting as the technical challenges. Harry's trust in adult authority figures had already been shattered by years of abuse from the Dursleys. Learning that Dumbledore, the one adult he had believed truly cared about his welfare, had been complicit in that abuse might be more damaging than the magical theft itself. We tell him the truth, Sirius said, though his voice suggested he understood the difficulty of that approach. Harry deserves to know what's been done to him, regardless of how painful that knowledge might be. But we tell him carefully, Tonks added. Start with the technical facts, the ward analysis, the energy quantification, the evidence of systematic theft. Let him process the reality of what happened before we delve into the emotional implications of who was responsible. And we make sure he understands that this doesn't diminish what he's accomplished, Remus continued. Everything Harry has achieved, surviving Voldemort, excelling at defense, performing magic that amazes even experienced wizards, he's done while operating at 2/3 capacity. His true potential is far greater than even he realizes. Bill nodded, adding psychological preparation to his growing list of considerations for their intervention. We'll need to time the revelation carefully. Tell him after we've successfully removed the siphoning ward, when we can present the theft as a problem we've already solved, rather than an ongoing threat to his welfare. That brings us to the question of broader support, Remus said, pulling out a list of Order members he had been evaluating. We can't keep this information contained indefinitely. Eventually, other members will need to know what we've discovered about Dumbledore's methods. Sirius's expression hardened. Most of the Order wouldn't believe us, even with ironclad evidence. Dumbledore's reputation for moral authority is too deeply ingrained. They'll assume we've been deceived or corrupted, rather than accept that their beloved leader has been systematically abusing Harry. But there are exceptions, Tonks said thoughtfully. Order members whose loyalty runs more to Harry personally than to Dumbledore institutionally. People who have already expressed concerns about some of the headmaster's more questionable decisions. "Who did you have in mind?" Bill asked. "McGonagall," Remus said immediately. "Her loyalty to Harry is absolute, and she's already challenged Dumbledore's judgment regarding Harry's welfare multiple times. She was opposed to placing Harry with the Dursleys from the beginning. She might be more receptive to evidence that those concerns were justified." Bill considered the suggestion carefully. Minerva McGonagall's reputation for moral integrity was nearly as unassailable as Dumbledore's, but her protective instincts toward her students were legendary. If they could present their evidence in a way that appealed to her maternal instincts rather than challenging her institutional loyalties, McGonagall could also provide additional magical support during the ward removal, he realized. Transfiguration mastery of her caliber would be invaluable for stabilizing ward structures during the disconnection process. And her position as deputy headmistress gives her the authority to act independently of Dumbledore if necessary, Tonks added. If we need to protect Harry from retaliation after exposing the truth, McGonagall could provide sanctuary at Hogwarts. Sirius was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Minerva has known Harry since he was 11. She's watched him struggle with limitations that she attributed to his difficult childhood. Learning that those limitations were artificially imposed might be enough to overcome her loyalty to Dumbledore. "How do we approach her?" Remus asked. "Carefully," Bill replied. "We present the technical evidence first, ward analysis, energy quantification, financial records. Let her professional expertise as a transfiguration master evaluate the magical aspects before we discuss the personal implications for Harry." "When?" Tonks asked. Bill consulted the lunar calendar he had been using to plan the ward removal timing. "The new moon is in 3 days. Ward magic is most malleable during the dark moon phase, which will give us the best chance of safely disconnecting the parasitic elements without damaging the blood protection." 3 days, Sirius repeated. "Enough time to approach McGonagall, present our evidence, and prepare for the intervention. Assuming she agrees to help us." "And if she doesn't?" Remus asked. "Then we proceed without her support," Bill said firmly. "Harry has been stolen from for 15 years. Every day we delay is another day of ongoing magical theft, another day of Dumbledore profiting from a child's suffering." The Alliance exchanged glances, each member weighing the enormous responsibility they were assuming. They were planning to challenge one of the most powerful wizards alive, to expose crimes that could bring down the leadership of the resistance movement, and to perform experimental magical medicine on a boy whose future might depend on their success. "Are we certain this is the right choice?" Tonks asked quietly. "Once we act, there's no going back. The Order will never be the same. Harry's relationship with Dumbledore will be destroyed, and we'll be responsible for whatever consequences follow." "The right choice was made 15 years ago, when Dumbledore decided to steal from a 15-month-old child," Sirius replied, his voice carrying the cold fury that had sustained him through 12 years in Azkaban. "We're just correcting a wrong that should never have been allowed to continue this long." Bill carefully rolled up the technical diagrams, already mentally rehearsing the complex procedure that would either restore Harry's stolen potential or destroy the protection that had kept him alive since infancy. "Tomorrow we approach McGonagall. The day after, we finalize our preparation. 3 nights from now, under the new moon, we dismantle 15 years of systematic magical theft." "And then?" Remus asked. "Then Harry Potter finally discovers what he's truly capable of," Bill replied. "And the wizarding world learns exactly what Albus Dumbledore did to the boy who was supposed to be under his protection." As the Alliance dispersed to prepare for the most dangerous magical intervention any of them had ever attempted, Bill remained in the dining room, studying the ward removal procedures one final time. In 72 hours, he would either perform the most successful curse-breaking operation of his career, or become responsible for destroying the magical protection of the most important child in the wizarding world. But as he thought about 15 years of stolen magical development, about a boy who had accomplished extraordinary things while operating at 2/3 capacity, about the systematic abuse disguised as protection, Bill knew they were making the only choice that honor and conscience would allow. Harry Potter deserved to know his true potential, and he deserved to discover it free from the parasitic magic that had been stealing from him since infancy, even if restoring that potential meant tearing down the most respected wizard alive in the process. Chapter 9. The Breaking. The Order meeting had concluded with the usual mixture of frustration and grim determination, members dispersing into the London night to continue their individual missions in the war against Voldemort. Most had already left Grimmauld Place when Bill activated the kitchen's privacy wards, sealing the room with silencing charms that would contain what was about to become the most explosive confrontation in the Order's history. Dumbledore remained seated at the head of the scarred wooden table, his blue eyes twinkling with what Bill now recognized as calculated benevolence rather than genuine warmth. The headmaster's phoenix feather wand lay casually beside his teacup, a subtle reminder of the power that had made him the most feared wizard in Britain, by dark wizards and allies alike. "Albus," Remus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. "We need to discuss something concerning Harry's welfare, something that can't wait for the next formal meeting." Dumbledore's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the grandfatherly mask slipping for just a moment to reveal the calculating intelligence beneath. "Of course, Remus, though I must say, this seems rather dramatic for a discussion that could have taken place during the meeting." Bill pulled out the folders containing their evidence, spreading contracts and technical analysis across the table with the methodical precision he had once used to document ancient curses. "Because what we've discovered constitutes evidence of systematic magical abuse spanning 15 years. Abuse that has been commissioned, funded, and concealed by someone in this room." The silence that followed was absolute. Dumbledore's eyes moved over the documentation with the speed of someone accustomed to processing complex information quickly, his expression growing more guarded with each page. "I see you've been conducting unauthorized investigations into matters of considerable sensitivity," Dumbledore said finally. "May I ask what prompted this research?" "Professional curiosity about the ward structure at Privet Drive," Bill replied, watching Dumbledore's face carefully. "My curse-breaker training detected magical signatures that didn't match your description of simple blood protection." Sirius leaned forward, his grey eyes burning with suppressed fury. "What we found were contracts in your name for the installation of energy siphoning systems designed to steal Harry's magical development to fund Order operations." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled as he contemplated the evidence arrayed before him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had made impossible choices for the greater good. "I see you've discovered the more complex aspects of Harry's protection," he said carefully. "Yes, the ward system does redirect certain surplus magical energy to support our resistance efforts. But surely you understand the necessity of such measures in wartime?" "Surplus?" Bill's voice was dangerously quiet. "You've stolen 37% of Harry's magical development over 15 years. That's not surplus, that's systematic magical malnutrition imposed on a child." "And the emotional amplification system?" Tonks added, her aura training evident in the precise way she presented evidence. The ward modifications specifically designed to increase Harry's suffering in order to harvest more magical energy? Dumbledore's benevolent mask was beginning to crack, revealing flashes of the ruthless strategist who had orchestrated a war against the darkest wizard of the century. Sometimes the choices we make for the greater good require personal sacrifice from those we seek to protect. Personal sacrifice? Remus's voice carried a brittleness that spoke of decades of loyalty being systematically destroyed. Harry was 15 months old when you installed that system. He never consented to having his magical future stolen to fund your political agenda. The boy has been kept alive, Dumbledore replied with the first hint of steel in his voice. The blood protection has functioned exactly as intended. Voldemort has been unable to touch him. Surely that justifies the supplemental arrangements necessary to maintain our resistance capabilities. Bill felt his Cursebreaker's instincts crystallize into cold, professional fury. Let me explain exactly what you've done to Harry Potter, using technical language that even you can't manipulate with your philosophical justifications. He activated his portable ward analysis display, projecting the energy patterns they had documented at Privet Drive. This system isn't protection enhancement, it's parasitic theft. You've turned a 15-month-old child into a magical battery designed to feed off his suffering to power your organization. The emotional amplification ward ensures that Harry experiences maximum distress whenever he's at Privet Drive, Tonks continued, her voice growing harder with each word. The Dursleys' abuse isn't incidental cruelty. It's a feature of your system, designed to trigger magical surges that your siphoning ward can harvest. And the cumulative effect, Remus added, consulting their medical analysis, has been to stunt Harry's magical development by more than a third. Every struggle he's experienced at Hogwarts, every limitation he's encountered, every moment of exhaustion, all symptoms of the magical malnutrition you've systematically imposed on him. Dumbledore's expression had grown progressively more distant, as if he were retreating behind layers of justification built over decades of impossible choices. The war against Voldemort requires resources that the Ministry will not provide. The protection of the wizarding world sometimes demands sacrifices that you're willing to make using other people's children, Sirius interrupted, his voice carrying the cold fury of a man who had spent 12 years in Azkaban for crimes he didn't commit, while Dumbledore did nothing to investigate his innocence. James and Lily died believing their son would be safe. You turned him into a source of funding for your personal war. It was not personal. It was theft, Bill said flatly, his professional expertise cutting through Dumbledore's philosophical maneuvering like a blade through silk. Systematic, premeditated magical theft from a minor, continued over 15 years, generating approximately 15,000 galleons in stolen magical energy to fund operations you couldn't legitimately finance. The kitchen door opened unexpectedly, admitting a figure that made everyone turn in surprise. Minerva McGonagall stood in the doorway, her traveling cloak still fastened and her expression sharp with the alertness of someone who had detected magical disturbances from several blocks away. The privacy wards around this room are so strong, they're affecting the magical resonance of the entire house, she said, stepping inside and sealing the door behind her. What exactly is... McGonagall's words died as she saw the evidence spread across the kitchen table. Her experienced eye took in the ward analysis displays, the Gringotts financial records, the technical documentation that painted a clear picture of 15 years of systematic abuse. Minerva, Dumbledore said, his voice regaining some of its usual warmth. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about certain protective arrangements for Harry Potter's welfare. McGonagall moved to the table, her transfiguration mastery allowing her to interpret the ward analysis with professional competence. Bill watched her expression change as she processed what she was seeing. The careful integration of siphoning magic into protective wards, the financial record showing ongoing theft, the medical analysis documenting stunted magical development. This isn't protection, she said quietly, her Scottish accent thickening with suppressed emotion. This is systematic abuse, disguised as safeguarding. Minerva, surely you understand the complexities of wartime resource management. I understand that you turned an infant into a magical battery, McGonagall interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades protecting students from those who would harm them. I understand that every moment of Harry Potter's suffering at Privet Drive has been generating revenue for your operations. She turned to Bill, her expression grim but determined. How do we stop it? Dumbledore rose from his chair, his full magical presence suddenly filling the kitchen like a gathering storm. I cannot allow you to interfere with protective arrangements that have kept Harry Potter alive for 15 years. The risks of what? Bill stood to face him, his own magical signature flaring with the controlled power of someone who had survived the most dangerous tombs in Egypt. The risk that Harry might discover his true, magical potential. The risk that he might start asking uncomfortable questions about why he's been kept weak all these years. The blood protection is genuine, Sirius added, his voice deadly quiet. But it doesn't require the siphoning system. You could have protected Harry without stealing from him. You chose to profit from his suffering. I chose to ensure that the resistance against Voldemort would have the resources necessary to... You chose to fund your war using a child's stolen future, Remus said, his loyalty to Dumbledore finally collapsing under the weight of what he had learned. And you did it while convincing everyone who cared about Harry that his struggles were natural, that his limitations were his own fault. McGonagall moved to stand beside the Alliance, her decision made with the decisive clarity that had defined her entire career. Mr. Weasley, how long will it take to safely dismantle the siphoning system while preserving the legitimate blood protection? 6 hours of careful work at Privet Drive, Bill replied, already reaching for his curse-breaking equipment. With Professor McGonagall's transfiguration expertise to help stabilize the ward structure, we can remove every trace of the parasitic magic without compromising Harry's safety. Dumbledore's voice carried a warning that made the kitchen's ancient stones seem to tremble. If you damage those protections, if you leave Harry vulnerable to Voldemort through misguided interference, then we'll face the consequences of our actions, McGonagall said firmly, just as you should face the consequences of yours. Bill sealed his equipment bag and moved toward the kitchen door, the Alliance following him with the grim determination of people who had chosen conscience over convenience. Professor McGonagall, your experience with complex transfiguration will be invaluable for maintaining ward stability during the removal process. And if the old man tries to stop us? Sirius asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his wand. He won't, McGonagall said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. Because he knows that what he's done to Harry Potter is unconscionable, and he knows that we have the moral authority to stop it. As they prepared to leave Grimmauld Place for Privet Drive, Bill looked back at Dumbledore one final time. The most powerful wizard alive sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of his systematic betrayal of the boy he claimed to protect, his grandfatherly mask finally abandoned to reveal the calculating strategist beneath. 15 years, Albus, Bill said quietly. 15 years of stealing from a child. And for what? A war effort funded by the suffering of the person you're supposed to be protecting? Dumbledore didn't respond, his blue eyes now cold and distant as he contemplated the collapse of strategies built over decades of careful manipulation. The Alliance left him there, travelling through the London night toward No. 4 Privet Drive, where they would spend the next 6 hours dismantling the most sophisticated magical theft in wizarding history. By dawn, Harry Potter would finally discover what he was truly capable of, and the wizarding world would learn exactly what their most trusted leader had been willing to do for the greater good. The night air was cool against Bill's face as they apparated to little whinging, his curse-breaking equipment heavy with the weight of 15 years of accumulated injustice about to be corrected. Whatever consequences followed from their actions tonight, They would face them together. Because some choices were more important than politics, more important than institutional loyalty, more important than the comfortable lies that allowed good people to ignore uncomfortable truths. Harry Potter deserved better than being turned into a magical battery for the greater good. And tonight, he was finally going to get it. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. Harry Potter woke to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window at Grimmauld Place, and the overwhelming sensation that something fundamental had changed while he slept. The air itself seemed to hum with possibility, and when he sat up in bed, he felt more alert and energized than he could ever remember being. It was as if someone had removed a weight from his chest that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. His magic felt different, stronger, clearer, more responsive to his intent. When he reached for his glasses on the nightstand, the simple movement sent a small wave of magical energy through the room that made the dust motes dance in the morning light. For a moment, he wondered if he was experiencing some kind of magical surge related to adolescent development, but the sensation was too profound, too complete to be natural growth. A soft knock on his door interrupted his confused thoughts. "Harry." It was Bill's voice, unusually gentle and cautious. "Are you awake? We need to talk to you about something important." Harry dressed quickly and followed Bill downstairs to the kitchen, where he found an unexpected gathering. Remus, Tonks, Sirius, and Professor McGonagall were all seated around the scarred wooden table, their expressions a mixture of concern, relief, and something that looked like carefully contained anger. The remains of what appeared to have been a very long night were evident: empty coffee cups, rumpled robes, and the particular exhaustion that came from important work completed under stress. "Sit down, Harry," Sirius said, his voice carrying a gentleness that Harry hadn't heard since his godfather's return from Azkaban. "What we're about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. But you deserve to know the truth about what's been done to you." Harry settled into the chair across from them, his enhanced magical senses picking up traces of powerful magic that lingered around the group like smoke after a fire. "What kind of truth?" Bill pulled out a folder filled with technical documents and spread them across the table with the careful precision Harry had learned to associate with his curse-breaking work. "Harry, what do you know about the protective magic that's been keeping you safe at Privet Drive?" "The blood wards," Harry replied immediately. "Dumbledore explained that my mother's sacrifice created protection that lasts as long as I can call that place home. That's why I have to return there every summer." "That part is true," Remus said carefully. "The blood protection is genuine, and it has kept you safe from Voldemort. But there was another layer to the magic at Privet Drive, one that Dumbledore didn't tell you about." McGonagall leaned forward, her expression grave but determined. "Mr. Potter, the ward system protecting you included enchantments designed to siphon magical energy from your development and redirect it to fund order operations. You have been systematically drained of approximately 37% of your magical potential for your entire life." The words hung in the air like a curse waiting to detonate. Harry stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she had said. That's not possible. Dumbledore would never—" "Last night, we removed those siphoning enchantments," Bill said, his voice heavy with the weight of what they had done. "What you're feeling right now, the increased energy, the enhanced magical sensitivity, that's your natural capacity being restored after 15 years of artificial suppression." Harry's hands began to shake as the implications crashed over him like a wave. "You're saying that someone has been stealing my magic? For 15 years?" "Not someone," Sirius said, his voice carrying the cold fury that had sustained him through Azkaban. "Albus Dumbledore. He commissioned ward specialists to install the siphoning system when you were 15 months old. The Order of the Phoenix has been funded primarily through the theft of your magical development." The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Harry's increasingly rapid breathing. He looked around the table at faces he trusted, searching for any sign that this was some kind of elaborate joke or misunderstanding. But the technical documents spread before him, the exhaustion evident in their faces, the traces of powerful magic lingering in the air. Everything confirmed the devastating truth they were telling him. "The Dursleys," Harry said quietly, pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place with horrible clarity. Their abuse was designed to trigger emotional distress that would amplify the magical harvesting. Tonks finished gently. The worse they made you feel, the more magical energy the siphoning ward could steal from you. They were unwitting accomplices in a system specifically designed to profit from your suffering. Harry stood up abruptly, his restored magical power responding to his emotional turmoil by causing the kitchen's ancient window panes to rattle in their frames. Every summer, every year of my life, every time I struggled at Hogwarts, every time I felt weak or exhausted, were symptoms of magical malnutrition, McGonagall said, her voice thick with the guilt of someone who had unknowingly been complicit in a student's abuse. "Mr. Potter, everything you've accomplished, surviving Voldemort, excelling at defense against the dark arts, performing magic that amazes even experienced wizards, you've done while operating at 2/3 of your natural capacity." The rage that built in Harry's chest was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the explosive anger of adolescence or the desperate fury of life-or-death confrontations. It was the cold, calculated wrath of someone who had been systematically betrayed by the person they trusted most. "Where is he?" Harry's voice was deadly quiet. "Where is Dumbledore?" "Probably attempting damage control," Remus said carefully. "Word of what we discovered last night will spread through the Order quickly. Many members will have difficulty accepting that their leader has been systematically abusing the boy they thought they were protecting." As if summoned by Harry's question, the kitchen door opened to admit Albus Dumbledore, his usual grandfatherly demeanor replaced by the careful composure of a man facing the collapse of strategies built over decades. His blue eyes, usually twinkling with benevolent warmth, now carried the cold calculation of someone evaluating damage and planning countermeasures. "Harry, my boy," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying forced warmth that no longer had the power to deceive. "I understand that certain misunderstandings have been shared with you regarding your protection arrangements." Harry stood to face him, his restored magical signature flaring with power that made the kitchen's magical artifacts resonate in harmony. "Misunderstandings? You've been stealing my magic since I was 15 months old." "The complexities of wartime resource management require difficult choices." "You turned me into a magical battery," Harry interrupted, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Every moment of suffering at Privet Drive, every limitation I experienced at school, every time I felt weak or exhausted, all of it was feeding magical energy to your organization, while you convinced everyone who cared about me that my struggles were my own fault." Dumbledore's composure cracked slightly, revealing flashes of the ruthless strategist beneath the benevolent facade. "The protection provided by those arrangements has kept you alive, Harry. Surely you understand that some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." "Sacrifices that you forced on me without my knowledge or consent," Harry replied. "Sacrifices that you profited from while pretending to care about my welfare." The kitchen door opened again to admit Arthur and Molly Weasley, their faces showing the strain of people who had been awakened early with devastating news about someone they trusted implicitly. Behind them came Kingsley Shacklebolt and Mad-Eye Moody, their expressions grim as they took in the confrontation playing out around the kitchen table. "Albus," Arthur said, his voice carefully controlled. "Bill has shown us the evidence. The contracts, the financial records, the technical analysis. Is it true? Have you been systematically taking magical energy from Harry to fund Order operations?" The weight of accumulated testimony was becoming overwhelming. Dumbledore looked around the kitchen at faces that had once regarded him with unquestioning loyalty, now filled with doubt and growing anger as they processed what they had learned. The war against Voldemort requires resources that traditional funding sources cannot provide, Dumbledore said, falling back on strategic justifications that sounded increasingly hollow in the face of documented child abuse. Every galleon spent on safe houses, every sickle invested in protective equipment, every nut used to support our operations, all of it serves to protect the wizarding world from the greatest dark wizard in a century. By stealing from a child, Molly Weasley said, her voice carrying the maternal fury that had once faced down Death Eaters to protect her family, by turning Harry into a source of funding while convincing all of us that his struggles were natural growing pains. Harry felt something inside him settle into a cold, clear certainty. The anger was still there. The grief over 15 years of stolen potential was still devastating. But beneath it all was a growing understanding of what he needed to do next. "I'm leaving," he said quietly, his words cutting through the increasingly heated argument. "I won't stay in this house another night knowing that the Order has been funded by stealing from me since I was a baby." "Harry, where will you go?" Remus asked, his voice heavy with concern. "The blood protection at Privet Drive is still intact, but I'll never feel safe there, knowing that every moment of abuse was designed to harvest magical energy for Dumbledore's war chest," Harry finished. "I need to be somewhere that I can trust the people protecting me actually care about my welfare rather than what they can take from me." Bill stood up, his decision made with the same decisive clarity that had driven him to expose the magical theft in the first place. "You'll come home with me and Fleur. Shell Cottage is protected by ward work I installed personally. No hidden enchantments, no energy siphoning, no ulterior motives. Just genuine protection for someone we care about." "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone that had once commanded Harry's absolute loyalty. "Surely you understand that emotional reactions to complex wartime strategies are entirely justified when those strategies involve stealing magical development from children," McGonagall interrupted sharply. "Albus, what you've done to this boy is unconscionable. The fact that it served your broader purposes doesn't make it any less abusive." Harry looked around the kitchen at the people who had shaped his understanding of the wizarding world, realizing that some of the most important relationships in his life had been built on lies and manipulation. But as his eyes met those of Bill, Sirius, Remus, and the others who had risked everything to restore his stolen potential, he also realized that genuine care and protection were possible, if he was brave enough to accept them from people who had proven their loyalty through actions rather than words. "I'll pack my things," Harry said, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying, finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. "It's time I learned what it feels like to be protected by people who actually care about me, rather than what they can take from me." As he left the kitchen to gather his belongings, Harry felt his restored magical power responding to his emotional state with a strength and clarity he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand what he was truly capable of, and more importantly, he was beginning to understand the difference between genuine care and strategic manipulation. The boy who had survived the killing curse, while operating at 2/3 capacity, was about to discover what he could accomplish when the people protecting him actually had his best interests at heart. Chapter 11. New Foundations. Shell Cottage had never felt more like home than it did in the warm August sunlight streaming through its windows, carrying the salt-sweet scent of the sea and the promise of possibilities that Harry was only beginning to understand. 3 weeks had passed since Bill and the Alliance had restored his stolen magical potential, and Harry was discovering that recovery from 15 years of systematic abuse was as complex as it was liberating. The cottage itself seemed to respond to his presence, its ancient wards recognizing the difference between his previous magically suppressed visits and his current full capacity. Bill had installed every protective enchantment personally, and Harry could feel the difference between these honest safeguards and the parasitic system that had disguised theft as protection at Privet Drive. "Your magical signature is still stabilizing," Bill explained, as they worked together in the cottage's converted library, surrounded by curse-breaking texts and ward analysis equipment that Harry was learning to interpret with growing fascination. Think of it like a magical muscle that's been artificially constrained for 15 years. Now that the constraint is removed, you need to gradually build up to your full capacity. Harry nodded, focusing on the levitation exercise that would have been impossible for him just a month ago. The feather rose smoothly into the air and began executing complex patterns that required the kind of fine, magical control he had never possessed before. How long until I reach my full potential? Based on the magical restoration literature and my observations of your progress, probably 6 to 8 months for complete stabilization, Bill replied, making notes on Harry's improvement that were both professionally thorough and genuinely caring. But Harry, what you're capable of right now already exceeds what most adult wizards can accomplish. Your true potential is extraordinary. The library door opened to admit Fleur, carrying a tea tray and moving with the unconscious grace that Harry was learning to associate with advanced magical training rather than Veela heritage. She had been patient and methodical in helping him understand the gaps in his magical education, approaching the work with the precision of someone who understood what systematic disadvantage looked like. "Harry, I have prepared the exercises for wandless magic," she said, setting down the tea with practiced efficiency. "Your magical core is strong enough now to attempt techniques that would have been impossible before your restoration." Harry accepted the cup of tea gratefully, marveling at how different it felt to be cared for by people who expected nothing in return except the satisfaction of helping him flourish. Wandless magic? I thought that was advanced Newty-level work. For most wizards, yes, Fleur agreed, settling into the chair beside him with her own cup. But your magical capacity is not most wizards. With proper instruction and practice, you should be able to perform complex spells without your wand within the next few months. It was a concept that would have seemed impossible when Harry was operating at 2/3 capacity, struggling with theoretical magic and exhausting himself with extended spell work. Now, with his full magical potential beginning to manifest, he was starting to understand what Bill meant when he said that Harry's true abilities were extraordinary. "The important thing is that you're learning all of this by choice," Bill added, his curse-breaker's instincts alert to the psychological aspects of Harry's recovery as much as the magical ones. "No one is forcing magical development on you for their own purposes. Everything we're teaching you is for your benefit, at your pace, with your consent." The distinction mattered more than Harry could easily express. For 15 years, his magical education had been shaped by other people's agendas, Dumbledore's strategic needs, the school's curriculum requirements, the expectations of teachers who didn't understand that his limitations were artificially imposed. Now, for the first time, he was learning magic because he chose to, guided by people who genuinely wanted him to succeed. A soft knock on the library door announced the arrival of Mrs. Weasley, whose weekly visits to Shell Cottage had become a highlight of Harry's recovery. She carried a basket that undoubtedly contained enough food to feed a small army, her maternal instincts operating at full capacity now that she understood how thoroughly Harry's welfare had been neglected. "Harry, dear," she said, bustling into the room with the comfortable authority of someone who had claimed him as family without reservation. "How are the magical exercises going? You're not pushing yourself too hard, are you?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Weasley," Harry replied, though his smile was genuine rather than polite. "Bill and Fleur have been careful not to let me overdo things." "Good," she said firmly, beginning to unpack the basket with practiced efficiency. "After 15 years of magical malnutrition, the last thing you need is to exhaust yourself trying to catch up all at once. Recovery takes time." It was a conversation they'd had variations of during each visit, Mrs. Weasley's protective instincts clearly operating in overdrive as she processed the scope of what had been done to him. But unlike Dumbledore's strategic care, her concern felt genuine and uncomplicated. She wanted Harry to be healthy and happy simply because she cared about him, not because his welfare served any broader purpose. "Actually," Harry said, realizing he had something important to share. Professor McGonagall sent an owl yesterday about changes to my class schedule for this year. Bill looked up from his note-taking with interest. What kind of changes? Harry pulled out the letter he'd received, still marveling at the fact that educational decisions were now being made with his input rather than around his limitations. She's recommended that I be moved to advanced sections in defense, transfiguration, and charms, and she wants to add independent study options in subjects that weren't available to me before. Such as? Fleur asked, her academic mind clearly engaged. Advanced ward theory, magical theory, and something called practical magical applications that sounds like it's designed specifically for my restored capabilities. Harry set down the letter, still processing the implications. She also mentioned that if I'm interested, she could arrange for me to audit some 7th-year courses. Mrs. Weasley beamed with the pride of a mother whose child was finally receiving the educational opportunities they deserved. Oh, Harry, that's wonderful. You'll finally be able to learn magic at the level you're capable of, instead of being held back by artificial limitations. It was exactly the kind of educational support that Harry had needed for years, but couldn't access while operating at reduced capacity. McGonagall's reforms weren't just academic adjustments, they were recognition that his previous struggles had been symptoms of systematic abuse rather than natural limitations. The professor also asked about my intentions regarding defense against the dark arts. Harry continued, his voice growing more serious. Apparently my restored magical signature has been noticed by people who evaluate these things professionally. What kind of people? Bill asked, his curse-breaker's instincts alert to potential complications. Aura trainers, according to her letter. They're interested in whether I might consider accelerated training programs after graduation. Harry looked around at the people who had become his chosen family, realizing how much their support meant as he faced decisions about his future. She made it clear that the choice is entirely mine. No pressure, no obligations, no assumptions about what I owe the wizarding world. The distinction was crucial. For the first time in his life, Harry was being offered opportunities rather than having expectations imposed on him. The people evaluating his potential were interested in what he might choose to do with his abilities, not in how those abilities could be used to serve their purposes. What do you think you might want to do? Fleur asked gently, her question carrying genuine curiosity rather than pressure toward any particular answer. Harry considered the question carefully, marveling at the luxury of being able to make decisions based on his own interests rather than other people's strategic needs. I think I'd like to understand my full capabilities before I make any long-term commitments. For 15 years, I've been making decisions based on what I thought my limitations were. Now I need to learn what I'm actually capable of. That's very wise, Mrs. Weasley said, her approval evident. There's no rush to decide your entire future at 15, especially when you're still discovering what your true potential looks like. As afternoon faded into evening, the cottage filled with the comfortable domesticity that Harry was learning to associate with genuine family relationships. Fleur prepared dinner with the unconscious competence of someone who took pleasure in caring for people she loved, while Bill reviewed Harry's progress notes with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student was exceeding every expectation. Mrs. Weasley settled into the sitting room with her knitting, her presence a reminder that Harry now belonged to a family that included him not because of what he represented or what he could provide, but simply because they had chosen to care about his welfare. Harry, Bill said as they finished reviewing the day's magical exercises, I want you to know that, regardless of what you decide about your future, whether you choose aura training or academic research or something completely different, you'll always have a place here. This isn't temporary sanctuary until you figure out your next step. This is home for as long as you want it to be. The simple statement carried more weight than any of Dumbledore's grandiose speeches about duty and destiny. Bill wasn't offering conditional support based on Harry's usefulness to a broader cause. He was offering unconditional family membership based on genuine care. "Thank you," Harry said, his voice thick with emotion that he was still learning to express safely. "For everything. For exposing what was done to me. For restoring my magic. For giving me a real family. I don't know how to repay." "You don't repay family, Mrs. Weasley." Chapter 12. Moving Forward. The September morning air carried the familiar scent of adventure and possibility as Harry Potter stepped off the Hogwarts Express for his 6th year, but everything about his return felt fundamentally different. Students moved around him with the usual bustle of term beginning, but Harry walked with a confidence and presence that drew subtle glances of recognition, not because of his scar or his reputation, but because of the unmistakable aura of someone operating at their full magical potential. "Blimey, Harry," Ron said, as they settled into a compartment for the journey to the castle. "You look like you've grown a foot over the summer. What have Bill and Fleur been feeding you?" "Proper nutrition, apparently," Harry replied with a smile that carried more genuine warmth than his friends had seen from him in years. "Along with the kind of magical training that's possible when you're not operating under artificial limitations." Hermione looked up from the advanced texts she was already reviewing for the new term. "McGonagall sent me your new class schedule. Advanced sections in defense, transfiguration, and charms, plus independent study in ward theory and magical applications. Harry, these are practically Newt-level courses. And 7th-year defense seminars," Harry added, pulling out his own course materials with the satisfaction of someone whose educational opportunities finally matched their capabilities. "Professor McGonagall made it clear that my previous struggles were symptoms of the constraints I was under, not natural limitations." The careful way he phrased it spoke to the ongoing process of learning how to discuss 15 years of systematic abuse without letting the trauma define him. Bill and Fleur had helped him understand that healing meant integration rather than avoidance, acknowledging what had been done to him while refusing to let it diminish his future possibilities. "How are you feeling about all of it?" Hermione asked, her academic mind clearly fascinated by the implications of Harry's restored capabilities. "The enhanced magical capacity, the advanced coursework, the changes in your relationship with the Order." Harry considered the question carefully, marveling at how different it felt to be asked about his feelings by someone who genuinely wanted to understand, rather than gather intelligence for strategic purposes. "Like I'm finally discovering who I actually am, instead of who other people's agendas made me think I was." The honesty of that response seemed to resonate with both his friends. Ron, who had spent years watching Harry struggle with limitations that everyone attributed to his difficult background, nodded with understanding that spoke to genuine friendship rather than the competitive jealousy that had sometimes strained their relationship. "Must be brilliant, though," Ron said, his voice carrying genuine enthusiasm. "Finally being able to show what you're actually capable of, instead of being held back by things that weren't even real." When they arrived at Hogwarts, the changes in Harry's magical signature were immediately evident to anyone with the training to recognize them. Professor McGonagall greeted him at the entrance to the Great Hall with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student was finally receiving the educational opportunities they deserved. "Mr. Potter," she said, her Scottish accent warm with approval, "I trust your summer with Mr. and Mrs. Weasley was productive? Your placement exams suggest that your magical development has stabilized remarkably well." "Bill and Fleur were excellent teachers," Harry replied, using their first names with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been welcomed into their family without reservation. "I'm looking forward to discovering what I can accomplish in an academic environment that's designed to challenge my actual abilities rather than accommodate artificial limitations." The distinction was important to McGonagall, who had spent months reforming Harry's educational program once she understood that his previous struggles had been symptoms of systematic abuse rather than natural academic challenges. Her approach to his 6th-year curriculum reflected both professional expertise and genuine care for his development. "Your first defense seminar is tomorrow morning," she informed him, Professor Lupin will be guest lecturing on advanced protective magic. I believe you'll find the material both challenging and relevant to your interests." Remus Lupin's involvement in Harry's education represented another positive change, resulting from the exposure of Dumbledore's methods. The werewolf's expertise in defense was being utilized not to serve broader strategic purposes, but to provide Harry with the advanced training that his restored capabilities made possible. As the weeks progressed, Harry's enhanced magical abilities became evident in every aspect of his academic work. Spells that had once required significant effort now responded to his intent with precision and power that impressed even experienced professors. His theoretical understanding deepened as he was finally able to access advanced magical concepts without the cognitive fatigue that had previously limited his academic performance. "Harry," Hermione said one evening, as they worked together in the library on an advanced transfiguration project, "watching you work now compared to previous years. It's like seeing someone finally able to breathe properly after years of partial suffocation." The analogy was more accurate than she realized. Harry's magical core no longer experienced the constant drain that had characterized his entire educational career. Instead, his power flowed freely and responsively, allowing him to attempt techniques and understand concepts that would have been impossible while he was operating at 2/3 capacity. But perhaps more importantly than his academic improvements was the change in his emotional stability. The constant exhaustion and irritability that had marked his teenage years had been replaced by a sense of balance and confidence that affected every aspect of his relationships. "You seem happier," Ron observed one afternoon, as they practiced advanced dueling techniques in an empty classroom. "Not just more powerful, actually happier." Harry paused in his spell work, considering how to explain the difference between being cared for strategically and being loved unconditionally. "I think it's because I finally understand what it feels like to be protected by people who actually care about my well-being rather than what I can do for them." The regular letters from Bill served as constant reminders of that unconditional support. His unofficial guardian role had evolved into something that felt more like genuine family than any relationship Harry had ever experienced. Bill's correspondence combined professional pride in Harry's magical development with personal affection that expected nothing in return except the opportunity to continue caring. "Harry, Fleur says to tell you that your wandless magic exercises are progressing faster than even she anticipated. Your last letter mentioned successfully casting a corporeal Patronus without your wand. That's NERWT, level magic that most adult wizards can't manage, even with full focus and proper equipment. More importantly, Mrs. Weasley wants to know if you're eating properly and whether you need any additional winter robes. She's convinced that Hogwarts doesn't feed students adequately, despite having 7 children go through the school herself. Remember that Shell Cottage is your home, regardless of what you decide about your future. Whether you choose aura training, academic research, or something completely different, you'll always have a place with people who care about you simply because you're you. Love, Bill." The casual way Bill signed the letter with love represented a kind of emotional security that Harry had never experienced before. It wasn't conditional on his performance or usefulness. It was simply offered because he belonged to a family that had chosen to include him. The changes in Harry's situation had also affected the broader dynamics of the Order of the Phoenix. Dumbledore's authority had been permanently undermined by the exposure of his systematic abuse, and many Order members had gravitated towards supporting approaches that prioritized Harry's agency rather than treating him as a strategic asset. "The old man's lost most of his influence," Sirius reported during one of his visits to Hogwarts. "Half the Order refuses to take orders from someone who turned a child into a magical battery. The other half questions every decision he makes, wondering what other necessary sacrifices he's been concealing." This shift in Order dynamics had practical implications for how the war effort was being conducted. Instead of strategies that treated Harry as a weapon to be deployed, the resistance movement was beginning to approach him as an empowered participant whose consent and well-being were essential considerations. Professor McGonagall asked me to pass along a message, Sirius continued. Some ministry officials have been inquiring about your post-graduation plans. Apparently, word about your restored capabilities has reached people who evaluate these things professionally. Harry nodded, already aware that his enhanced abilities had attracted attention from various quarters. What kind of inquiries? Aura training programs, mostly, but also offers from the Department of Mysteries, the International Confederation of Wizards, and something called the Advanced Magical Research Division. Sirius's expression grew serious. The important thing is that these are genuine opportunities being offered to you personally, not obligations being imposed because of what you represent to the war effort. The distinction mattered enormously. For the first time in his life, Harry was being approached as an individual with valuable abilities rather than as a symbol to be manipulated for broader purposes. The opportunities being presented to him were based on recognition of his potential, not expectations about his duty. I'm not ready to make any long-term decisions yet, Harry said, appreciating the luxury of being able to prioritize his own development over external pressures. I want to understand my full capabilities before I commit to any particular path. That's exactly what you should do, Sirius agreed, with the satisfaction of a godfather whose charge was finally free to make autonomous choices. You've got time to figure out what you want to do with your life, now that it's actually yours. As winter settled over Hogwarts, Harry reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past 6 months. He was no longer the magically suppressed, emotionally manipulated teenager who had struggled through his first 5 years at school. Instead, he had become someone operating at full capacity, supported by people who genuinely cared about his welfare, free to make decisions based on his own interests and values. His approach to the war against Voldemort had evolved accordingly. Rather than accepting the role of sacrificial weapon that Dumbledore had prepared for him, Harry was beginning to understand himself as an empowered participant who could choose how and when to engage with the broader conflict. The prophecy Dumbledore told me about, Harry said to Professor McGonagall during one of their regular consultations about his academic progress. How much of that was accurate, and how much was strategic manipulation designed to ensure my compliance? McGonagall's expression grew thoughtful. The prophecy itself appears to be genuine, Mr. Potter, but I suspect that Professor Dumbledore's interpretation of its requirements may have been influenced by his own strategic preferences. It was a careful way of acknowledging that Harry's destiny might be more flexible than he had been led to believe. The prophecy spoke of choices and power, but perhaps not the specific path of self-sacrifice that Dumbledore had presented as inevitable. As the term progressed toward its end, Harry found himself looking forward to the future with genuine excitement rather than resignation. His magical abilities continued to develop, his relationships deepened through honest communication, and his sense of personal agency grew stronger with each autonomous decision he was allowed to make. The boy who had once been turned into a magical battery for someone else's war effort had become a young man capable of choosing his own battles, supported by people who loved him unconditionally, confident in abilities that were finally his to control. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whether in his remaining time at Hogwarts, his post-graduation choices, or his eventual confrontation with Voldemort, Harry Potter would face them as himself, fully empowered and genuinely protected, surrounded by people who had proven their care through actions rather than words. For the first time since he was 15 months old, Harry Potter's future belonged entirely to him.